Hello there and welcome to Secretum Histories. Tonight we are stepping gently into a part of history that does not announce itself loudly, does not open with gods descending from the sky, and does not begin with names that feel familiar or dramatic. Instead, we are moving into a quieter space, one that exists beneath later stories, beneath hierarchies, beneath even the idea that beings arrived at all. Before we continue, take a moment to settle in. Adjust the volume if you need to, maybe lower the lights. Perhaps there is a familiar background sound where you are, a fan, distant traffic, or the soft hum of a room at rest. If this kind of exploration helps you unwind, you can like the video or subscribe, but only if it genuinely feels right for you. This channel exists for those moments when curiosity and calm overlap, and when history becomes something you listen to rather than something you study. Tonight's focus is simple, but not small. We're exploring what the Sumerian texts themselves suggest existed before the Anunnaki ever appear in the record. Not before they ruled, not before they acted, but before they are named at all. Before they become characters. Before the world is described as a place governed by councils, commands, or divine authority. Most modern discussions begin too late. They start with gods already present, already organized, already powerful. They assume arrival as the starting point. But the earlier Sumerian material does something very different. It begins in a place where nothing arrives, because nothing is separate enough to arrive anywhere. The texts do not open with motion. They open with condition. When we read the oldest surviving Sumerian compositions, especially those that deal with beginnings, we find no sudden descent, no dramatic intrusion into an empty world. Instead, we find descriptions of existence as a state that already is. Not finished, not ordered in the way later ages would understand order, but present nonetheless. The world does not begin as a stage waiting for actors. It begins as something closer to an undivided environment, where distinction itself has not yet fully formed. This is important, because it means the Sumerians did not imagine the universe as a place created for gods to step into. The universe, in their earliest thinking, is something that emerges gradually, internally, without an external arrival triggering its existence. There is no sense that someone comes from elsewhere to start things. There is only the sense that things slowly become defined. What existed before the Anunnaki, according to these texts, is not another group of gods with different names. It is not a hidden civilization. It is not a lost golden age ruled by forgotten kings. It is something far less dramatic and far more foundational. It is a state where the world functions without rulers. The earliest Sumerian language reflects this. The vocabulary used in these compositions is limited, restrained, and often indirect. Instead of describing personalities, the texts describe conditions. Instead of focusing on beings, they focus on relationships between elements. Water, space, ground, and continuity are emphasized far more than will, intention, or command. This suggests that the Sumerians were not primarily interested in who was in charge at the beginning. They were interested in how existence held together before authority was introduced. At this early stage, the world is not governed, it is balanced. The later gods, including the Anunnaki, are always associated with roles. They judge, they decide, they assign fates, they enforce boundaries. None of that appears at first. What we encounter instead is a form of existence, where boundaries are present only as tendencies, not as rules. The Sumerian scribes did not have a single word for this state. They circled around it. They described it using references to water that is not yet divided, space that is not yet separated, and time that is not yet measured. This is not mythology in the modern sense. It is closer to early cosmology, an attempt to describe what reality feels like before structure is imposed upon it. In this earliest phase, nothing needs permission to exist. Nothing is assigned a task. Nothing is told what it must do. This is why the Anunnaki cannot appear here. Their very definition requires hierarchy. The term itself refers to lineage, to descent, to status. That only makes sense once differentiation exists. Before differentiation, there can be no princes, no offspring of heaven, no ranks. So what existed instead was not chaos in the sense of disorder. It was undivided continuity. The Sumerians lived in a landscape where water shaped everything. Rivers created life, but also erased it. Floods destroyed boundaries between fields, homes, and cities. When floodwaters receded, the land reformed itself. Channels had to be redrawn. Borders had to be re-established. In this environment, the idea of an undivided state was not abstract. It was something people experienced regularly. When the texts speak of the earliest time, they often use language associated with water, not because water was worshipped, but because water represented continuity without fixed edges. Before canals, water goes everywhere. Before walls, water ignores ownership. Before cities, water simply flows. This becomes a model for understanding existence itself. Before the Anunnaki, the world is described as something that flows rather than something that is ruled. There is no council deciding outcomes. There is no divine assembly issuing decrees. There is no punishment, no reward, no judgment. Those concepts only appear once beings with authority appear, and those beings appear later. In this earlier stage, the texts do not describe humans either. Humanity does not exist yet, not because it has not been created, but because creation as an intentional act has not yet begun. There is no moment where someone decides to make humans. That idea belongs to a later phase, when labour, responsibility, and complaint become part of the story. At the beginning, there is nothing to complain about. This absence of complaint is telling. The Sumerian gods, when they appear later, complain frequently. They complain about noise. They complain about labour. They complain about imbalance. None of that exists yet. The world before the Anunnaki is silent, not because it is empty, but because nothing is resisting anything else. The texts reflect this silence in their structure. They are less narrative, more descriptive. Events do not happen yet. States simply exist. There is also no morality at this stage. No one behaves correctly or incorrectly. There are no transgressions because there are no laws to transgress. There is no obedience because there is no command. Morality, like authority, appears later. This challenges many modern assumptions. We often imagine beginnings as violent or dramatic. Explosions, conflicts, wars among gods. The Sumerian material suggests something quieter, something slower, something that does not need explanation yet. The Anunnaki, when they eventually appear, will bring explanation. They will define roles, they will enforce order, they will determine fates. But before they do, the world operates without explanation. This is not ignorance, it is pre-explanation. The scribes who preserved these ideas did not see this stage as inferior. They did not portray it as something that needed correction. It is simply earlier, not worse, not better, just earlier. And this is where later interpretations often go wrong. When modern readers look for advanced beings or hidden technology before the Anunnaki, they are projecting later ideas backward. The Sumerian texts do not support that projection. They do not describe a lost civilization before the gods. They describe a condition before governance. There is a subtle but crucial difference. The earliest Sumerian worldview does not ask who ruled first. It asks what existed before rule itself became necessary. That question shapes everything that follows. As the texts slowly move forward, distinctions begin to form. Heaven and earth will eventually separate. Roles will eventually be assigned. Authority will eventually solidify. But none of that is present yet. And the absence is intentional. The scribes knew what they were doing. They were not careless. They were deliberate in how they structured these accounts. They began with a world that does not yet require management. Only later does management appear. This tells us something about how the Sumerians understood power. Power was not the source of existence. Power was a response to complexity. When existence becomes complex, when beings multiply, when activities overlap, when noise increases, then authority becomes necessary. That is when gods like the Anunnaki enter the picture, not as creators of existence itself, but as administrators of a world that has grown too intricate to regulate itself. So before the Anunnaki, there is no administration, there is no judgment, there is no hierarchy, there is only continuity. This continuity is fragile. The texts imply that it cannot last indefinitely, but they do not frame it as a mistake. It is simply a phase, and as we move forward, a separation begins to appear, a structure starts to form. This quiet state will slowly give way to something more defined, more managed, and ultimately more controlled, without ever fully disappearing beneath the layers that follow. Before arrival was a concept, the Sumerian texts describe a world that does not yet recognize movement as intrusion. There is no language of descent, no implication that something comes from elsewhere to enter an already prepared space. The earliest layers of writing instead reflect a mindset in which existence is continuous, not segmented into origins that arrive and destinations that receive. This is not because the Sumerians lacked imagination, but because the structure of their earliest worldview did not require the idea of arrival to function. When later traditions speak of gods coming down, descending, or intervening, they rely on a conceptual framework that assumes separation. There must be a place one comes from, a place one arrives at, and a boundary that is crossed between them. The oldest Sumerian compositions show no evidence that such boundaries were originally assumed. Instead, the world is presented as something already present, already extended, already in motion internally, without the need for external entry. This absence is subtle, but it is consistent. In the earliest texts, verbs associated with travel, descent, or arrival are rare and usually applied only after hierarchy has been established. Before that point, the language focuses on conditions rather than actions. The world is described as being in a certain state, rather than undergoing a sequence of events initiated by an outside force. This suggests that the Sumerians initially conceived of existence as self-contained. The difference matters because it changes how everything that follows is interpreted. If nothing arrives, then nothing interrupts. The world does not begin because something enters it. It begins because distinctions slowly emerge within it. Separation replaces arrival as the fundamental mechanism of change. This is why the earliest texts emphasize undivided states. Heaven and earth are not places yet. They are conditions. Water is not an environment something moves through. It is the environment itself. There is no sense that anything must cross into existence. Existence is already everywhere. The idea of arrival presupposes an outside. But in the earlier Sumerian worldview, there is no outside. There is only continuity that has not yet been broken into regions. Later traditions would struggle with this. As language developed and social structures grew more complex, it became easier to imagine origins as moments and beginnings, as events. But the earlier scribes preserved traces of a much older understanding, one that did not rely on narrative motion to explain how the world came to be. This is why the texts do not open with stories of arrival. They open with descriptions of what already is. In these descriptions, time itself is not yet linear. There is no before and after in the way later myths require. Instead, there is a sense of duration without measurement. Things exist, but they do not progress. They are present without moving toward an outcome. This is difficult to express in later languages, which are built around sequence and causation. But the Sumerian language, especially in its earliest forms, retains traces of this non-linear thinking. The scribes were not trying to tell a story yet. They were trying to preserve a state. This is also why names are initially absent or secondary. To name something is to distinguish it from what surrounds it. Before arrival is a concept. Naming is unnecessary. The texts reflect this by delaying the introduction of named beings until after separation occurs. Only once the world is divided does it become meaningful to assign identities. This delay has often been misunderstood. Some modern readers assume missing names indicate lost information or damaged tradition. But the consistency of the pattern suggests intention. The earliest worldview did not require named actors to function. Existence was not personalized yet. This becomes especially clear when examining how later gods are introduced. They do not arrive from elsewhere. They emerge from relationships that already exist. Heaven and earth separate, and from that separation come forces that can be personified. But even then, the emphasis is not on arrival, but on differentiation. The Anunnaki, when they finally appear, are never described as arriving into a void. They are born into a system that already has shape. Their presence assumes a world that has already moved beyond the undivided state. So what existed before arrival was not absence. It was fullness without borders. This fullness did not require explanation. It did not demand justification. It simply existed as the default condition of reality. The later need to explain how gods came, why humans were made, and who ruled what only arises once complexity introduces friction. Before that friction, there is no need for intervention. The Sumerians lived in an environment that reinforced this idea. Their landscape was defined by gradual changes rather than sudden intrusions. Rivers shifted over time, floodplains expanded and contracted. Land emerged slowly as waters receded. Nothing arrived abruptly, everything transformed. This environmental experience shaped how they thought about beginnings. The world did not start because something arrived. It started because something changed state. This distinction is critical when reading later myths backward into earlier texts. When modern interpretations impose arrival narratives onto the earliest material, they distort the original meaning. The Sumerian scribes were not describing visitors. They were describing transitions. The earliest transitions are internal. Water differentiates. Space opens. Direction becomes meaningful. Only after these changes does the concept of movement from one place to another become relevant. Until then, movement has no reference point. This is why even the language of descent, when it appears later, often functions metaphorically rather than literally. To descend is to take on responsibility. To rise is to assume authority. These are social metaphors projected onto cosmology, not records of physical travel. Before arrival becomes a concept, there is no hierarchy to move through. Hierarchy itself is a late development. The earliest worldview does not place beings above or below one another. It does not organize reality vertically. It experiences reality as layered but not ranked. Only when order begins to solidify does vertical thinking emerge. Heaven becomes above. Earth becomes below. Underworld becomes beneath. Once this vertical model exists, arrival becomes possible. Something can come down or go up. But before that, there is no directionality that supports such ideas. The Anunnaki belong to a vertical world. Their very name implies rank and descent within a hierarchy. That hierarchy does not exist yet in the earliest phase, so before arrival, there is no place to arrive from and no place to arrive to. The texts preserve this by their silence. They do not fill the beginning with events, they allow the beginning to remain open-ended. This openness is uncomfortable for modern readers who expect narrative momentum, but it reflects a different understanding of what beginnings are. Beginnings are not moments, they are conditions. This is also why the earliest material resists dramatization. There is nothing to dramatize yet. No conflict, no desire, no dissatisfaction, no need for change. Change comes later. When it does, it will be described carefully, as something that alters a stable state rather than initiates existence itself. The scribes understood that once arrival becomes possible, consequences follow. Arrival introduces difference. Difference introduces comparison. Comparison introduces judgment. Judgment introduces authority. All of that lies ahead. Before arrival was a concept, the world did not need to be governed. It did not need to be explained. It did not need to be justified. It simply persisted. And that persistence is what the texts quietly preserve beneath the later stories that would eventually overshadow it, without ever fully erasing the memory of a time when nothing came from elsewhere, because everything was already there. The earliest tablets that do not mention gods at all are often overlooked, not because they are insignificant, but because they are difficult to classify within later religious frameworks. These texts exist at the edge of what we usually call mythology. They do not deny the existence of divine forces, but they do not invoke them either. Instead, they record observations, structures and conditions without attributing agency to named beings. This absence is not accidental, and it is not a gap created by damage or loss. It reflects a stage of thought in which the world was not yet interpreted through divine personalities. When writing first appears in southern Mesopotamia, its purpose is not theological. The earliest tablets are administrative, economic and descriptive. They track grain, livestock, labour, land and exchange. They describe how things are arranged, how much exists, where it moves and who is responsible. What they do not do is explain these systems by referencing gods. This is striking, especially when contrasted with later periods where nearly every activity is framed as divinely sanctioned. In these early records, order exists without justification. Systems function without explanation. Authority is present, but it is human and procedural, not cosmic. The tablets show a world that operates according to rules that are practical rather than sacred. This suggests that the earliest Sumerian worldview did not require divine narration to understand reality. This does not mean the Sumerians were irreligious. It means that religion had not yet absorbed every aspect of explanation. There was a distinction between how the world worked and how meaning was later assigned to it. The earliest tablets sit firmly on the side of function rather than belief. These texts are often written in proto-cuneiform, a transitional script that predates full phonetic writing. The signs are pictographic, representing objects and quantities rather than sounds or names. This limits what can be expressed, but it also reveals priorities. The focus is on tangible reality, on what can be counted, stored, moved, or measured. Gods, if they existed conceptually, were not part of this immediate concern. The absence of divine names in these tablets suggests that the earliest conception of order did not depend on divine oversight. Cities functioned, agriculture operated, trade networks existed, labour was organised. All of this occurred without invoking supernatural authority in the written record. This challenges the assumption that religion precedes social structure. In Sumer, at least in the earliest written phase, structure appears first. Religion follows later as an interpretive layer placed over an already functioning system. When gods do appear in later texts, they are often retroactively inserted into roles that humans were already performing. A god becomes responsible for irrigation, but irrigation systems existed before that attribution. A god becomes patron of a city, but the city existed before the god was assigned to it. This pattern suggests that divine figures were used to explain and legitimize existing arrangements, rather than to create them. The earliest tablets show no concern with origin stories. They do not ask where the world came from. They assume the world is already present and focus on how to operate within it. This practical orientation reflects a worldview grounded in immediate experience rather than speculative cosmology. This is significant for understanding what existed before the Anunnaki. Before named gods entered the record, there was a functioning society that did not require divine explanation for its daily operations. The world was understood as manageable without reference to higher beings. Later myths would reinterpret this period as divinely guided, but the original documents do not support that interpretation. The silence regarding gods is consistent across multiple sites and contexts. It is not an anomaly. These tablets come from the late Uruk period, roughly the 4th millennium BCE. They represent the earliest stage of urban civilization. Writing itself is new. The concept of recording information externally is still experimental. In this context, the choice to record economic and administrative data rather than religious narratives is revealing. If the Sumerians had viewed gods as essential to understanding their world at this stage, we would expect divine names to appear early. They do not. Instead, we see lists, tallies, and accounts. This suggests that the earliest worldview prioritized stability and continuity over explanation. The world is treated as self-evident. There is no attempt to justify why things exist or why they function as they do. They simply do. This absence of gods also means there is no moral framework imposed on the record. Actions are not judged as good or bad. They are recorded as successful or unsuccessful, complete or incomplete. Responsibility is practical, not ethical. This changes later. When gods enter the picture, morality follows. Actions become subject to divine approval or disapproval. Punishment and reward appear, but none of that exists yet in the earliest tablets. The Anunnaki, who later become associated with judgment and fate, would have no role in this early world. There is nothing to judge. Fate is not yet assigned. Outcomes are determined by human action and environmental conditions. This suggests that before the Anunnaki, the world is not morally structured. It is operationally structured. The shift from operational to moral structure is gradual. It coincides with the emergence of named gods and divine hierarchies. As society becomes more complex, explanations become more necessary. As inequality grows, authority needs justification. Gods provide that justification. But the earliest tablets preserve a memory of a time before that shift, a time when explanation was not yet required. This does not mean the Sumerians believed the world had no deeper meaning. It means that meaning was not yet articulated through narrative. The earliest worldview was implicit rather than explicit. The silence of these tablets is not empty. It is functional. They show a world that exists without storytelling. This has implications for how we read later myths. When gods are introduced as creators or rulers, they are entering a world that already exists. They are not bringing order from nothing. They are assuming control over systems that are already in place. The earliest tablets support this interpretation. They show that order precedes authority. This undermines later narratives that place divine beings at the very beginning of existence. The written record does not support that chronology. Instead, it suggests a layered understanding of reality. First comes function, then comes explanation, then comes authority. The Anunnaki belong to the third layer. Before them, there is a world that works. This world is not perfect. It is vulnerable to floods, droughts, and instability. But its challenges are environmental, not moral. There is no sense that disasters are punishments, or that success is reward. Things happen because conditions align or fail to align. This pragmatic worldview is visible in how resources are managed. Grain is stored to prepare for scarcity. Labour is organised to maintain infrastructure. There is foresight, but not prophecy. When gods later take over these domains, they are portrayed as controllers of forces that humans already recognised. Rain, fertility, and growth are given divine patrons, but they were already understood as essential factors in survival. The earliest tablets do not deny the sacred, they simply do not articulate it yet. This suggests that the sacred emerges as a response to complexity, rather than as an initial condition. As writing evolves, language becomes capable of expressing abstraction. Names appear, narratives form. The world becomes populated with beings who embody principles that were previously implicit. But before that evolution, the world exists without gods in the written record. This absence is not ignorance, it is restraint. The scribes did not invent gods to explain what they already understood. They first learned how to manage their world. Only later did they learn how to narrate it. This sequence matters. It means that when the Anunnaki finally appear in the texts, they're entering a story that has already begun. They are not the first actors. They are not the origin. They are a development. The earliest tablets preserve the quiet evidence of that earlier stage, a stage where the world did not need to be ruled because it had not yet become crowded enough to require rulers. As population grows, as cities expand, as conflicts arise, the need for higher authority becomes more pressing. Gods emerge to fill that role. But before that need arises, there is only record, and those records show a world that exists without divine narration, operating steadily, waiting not for arrival, but for interpretation to catch up with reality. Existence as structure, not story, is one of the most difficult ideas to hold on to when reading the earliest Sumerian material, because it runs against the way modern minds are trained to understand beginnings. We expect a narrative. We look for characters, actions, causes, and consequences. We assume that if something exists, there must be a story explaining how it came to be. But the oldest layers of Sumerian thought do not operate this way. They do not present existence as a tale unfolding through events. They present it as a framework that is already in place. In these texts, the world does not begin because something happens. It begins because something is arranged. This difference is subtle but profound. A story implies sequence. One thing follows another. A structure, by contrast, implies relationship. Things exist alongside one another in a pattern that does not depend on motion to be meaningful. The earliest Sumerian worldview leans heavily towards structure. It is concerned with how elements relate, not with how events unfold. This is why the earliest descriptions of reality feel static to modern readers. There is no drama, no conflict, no turning point. Instead, there is an emphasis on placement, balance, and continuity. Heaven and earth are not characters, they are positions. Water is not an actor, it is a condition. Space is not travelled through, it is present. This way of thinking reflects a society that is learning how to stabilise itself. Early urban life required predictable systems. Irrigation canals had to function year after year. Fields had to be planted and harvested in regular cycles. Storage facilities had to preserve surplus across seasons. All of this demanded an understanding of structure before narrative. In such a context, explaining the world as a story would have been less useful than understanding it as an arrangement of forces that could be relied upon. The earliest texts mirror this priority. They do not ask why the world exists, they assume it does. They focus instead on how it holds together. This is why the language of these texts often lacks verbs of creation. Things are not made so much as they are differentiated. Boundaries appear, functions emerge, but there is no single moment where existence is initiated. There is only a gradual clarification of relationships. This structural thinking is especially visible in how space is described. The world is not divided into realms by dramatic acts. It is layered. There is above, below, and between. But these are not yet moralized or personified. They are simply regions defined by their properties. Above is associated with light and regular motion. Below is associated with depth and continuity. Between is associated with movement and interaction. None of these regions are ruled yet. They simply exist as parts of a whole. This layered structure is not explained through narrative because it does not need to be justified. It is experienced daily. The sky is there, the ground is there. Water flows between them. The world makes sense because it behaves consistently. In this worldview, consistency matters more than origin. Stories arise later, when consistency is disrupted, when floods destroy fields, when drought interrupts cycles, when social order becomes unstable. Narrative becomes a way to explain why things go wrong. But before that disruption, structure is enough. The The Sumerian texts preserve this early confidence in structure. They show a world that is intelligible without storytelling. This does not mean the Sumerians lacked imagination. It means imagination was not yet the primary tool for understanding reality. Observation and repetition were. Existence as structure also means that time is not yet treated as a narrative arc. There is no beginning, middle and end. There is only ongoing presence. Time is cyclical, not directional. Seasons repeat. Floods return. Growth follows decay. Nothing moves toward a final outcome. This cyclical understanding removes the need for a creation story in the modern sense. If the world has always existed in some form, then creation is not a singular event. It is an ongoing process of maintenance and adjustment. The earliest texts reflect this by avoiding language that suggests finality or origin points. They do not describe a moment when existence starts. They describe conditions under which existence continues. This also explains the absence of heroes. Stories need protagonists. Structures do not. In a structural worldview, no individual is essential. The system matters more than the parts within it. This perspective would later shift dramatically as kingship emerges. Kings require stories. Authority requires justification. Individual figures need narratives to legitimize their power. But before kingship becomes central, structure remains the dominant lens. This is why the earliest texts are impersonal. They list resources rather than achievements. They record transactions rather than deeds. They track movement of goods rather than movement of characters. Even when early religious ideas begin to form, they often take structural shapes. Gods are associated with domains rather than biographies. A deity represents water, grain, or sky long before they are given personal stories. Their function matters more than their personality. This functional approach reinforces the idea that existence is something that operates, not something that happens. The Anunnaki, when they appear later, bring narrative with them. They argue, they decide, they judge, they intervene. Their presence marks a shift from structure to story. But before that shift, the world is not dramatic enough to require such figures. This earlier phase is sometimes misinterpreted as primitive or incomplete, but it is neither. It is simply oriented differently. It prioritizes stability over explanation. The Sumerians lived in an environment where stability was fragile. Floods could undo years of work. Droughts could devastate communities. In such a context, understanding structure was a matter of survival. Stories could wait. This practical mindset shaped how reality itself was understood. Existence was not something to be narrated. It was something to be managed. This management extended to social organization. Roles existed before they were sanctified. Labor was divided before it was moralized. Authority functioned before it was divine. The earliest texts reflect a society that understood how to organize itself without invoking cosmic justification. That justification came later, when organization alone was no longer sufficient. As cities grew larger, as inequality increased, as power concentrated, explanation became necessary. Structure alone could not answer why some ruled and others laboured. Narrative stepped in to fill that gap. Gods entered the picture not to create structure, but to explain it. This sequence is critical for understanding what existed before the Anunnaki. Before them, there is no story demanding divine characters. There is only a system functioning as best it can under natural conditions. The earliest worldview does not deny mystery. It simply does not foreground it. Mystery exists in the background, unarticulated, not yet personified. This restraint is evident in how little speculation appears in early texts. There is no attempt to describe what lies beyond observable reality. There is no cosmological curiosity in the modern sense. The focus is on what can be interacted with. When speculation appears later, it takes the form of myth. But myth is a later development, layered onto a foundation that is already solid. Existence as structure also means that meaning is embedded in arrangement rather than narrative purpose. The world is meaningful because it works, because patterns repeat, because cause and effect are reliable. This reliability is what allows civilization to form. Without it, planning would be impossible. The earliest Sumerians trusted the world enough to build cities. That trust is reflected in their texts. They do not portray the world as hostile or unpredictable at its core. They portray it as something that can be engaged with, shaped, and maintained. Only later does the world become dangerous in a moral sense. Only later do disasters become punishments rather than events. Only later does chaos require explanation. The shift from structure to story marks a profound transformation in human thought. It is not a replacement, but an addition. Structure remains beneath the stories supporting them. The Anunnaki enter at the moment when story becomes necessary, when authority must be narrated, when decisions must be justified, when fate must be assigned. But before that moment, the world exists quietly, structured, balanced, and unnamed. The earliest Sumerian texts preserve this phase not by describing it directly, but by refusing to turn it into a story. Their silence is not absence, it is evidence. Evidence of a time when existence did not need characters, because it did not yet need explanation. And as the layers of narrative accumulate over this foundation, the structure remains steady and unchanged, continuing to support every story that follows, even when those stories begin to forget that structure was ever there. The primordial state the Sumerians struggle to describe is not presented in their texts as a mystery meant to be solved, but as a condition that resists language itself. This struggle is visible everywhere in the earliest material, not through dramatic statements of confusion, but through repetition, approximation, and careful avoidance of precision. The scribes were not failing to describe something they understood clearly. They were attempting to preserve the memory of something that existed before the tools of description were fully capable of containing it. This primordial state is not introduced as an event. It is not framed as a beginning in the way later traditions would imagine beginnings. There is no moment where it starts. Instead, it is treated as a baseline condition, something that precedes differentiation, naming, and function. The difficulty lies in the fact that writing itself depends on distinction. To write is to separate one thing from another. To name is to isolate. The primordial state, by definition, lacks isolation. This creates a fundamental tension. The scribes are trying to describe a condition that exists before description is possible. When the texts gesture toward this earlier state, they do so indirectly. They speak of water that is not yet divided. They speak of space that has not yet been separated into regions. They speak of time without sequence. None of these descriptions are literal, they are approximations. The scribes knew they were approximations, and they did not attempt to correct that limitation. They worked within it. The most consistent feature of this primordial state is undifferentiation. Everything exists, but nothing is distinct. This does not mean nothingness. It means fullness without boundaries. Modern language often collapses these ideas, but the Sumerian texts are careful not to. The primordial state is not empty. It is saturated. Water becomes the dominant metaphor not because it is the only element present, but because it best captures this saturation. Water fills spaces without respect for edges. It merges. It envelops. It moves without requiring permission. For a society whose survival depended on understanding water's behaviour, this metaphor carried immense weight. But even water is insufficient. The texts repeatedly imply that this primordial state is not water, as humans experience it. It is water as potential. Water before rivers, before seas, before rain, before flow has direction. This is water without shape. The scribes return to this idea again and again, not because they are unsure, but because there is no single way to say it. Each repetition is an attempt to approach the same condition from a slightly different angle. hoping to preserve some aspect of it without falsely defining it. This is why the primordial state is never personified at first. There are no faces, no wills, no intentions. Personification would impose boundaries. It would imply decision, desire, agency. None of those belong here yet. Instead, the primordial state is treated as a condition that gives rise to differentiation, without choosing to do so. Change happens, but it is not willed. It emerges. This is one of the most difficult ideas for later traditions to maintain. Once gods appear, change becomes intentional. Decisions are made, actions have motives. But before that shift, change is simply transformation. It has no moral or strategic dimension. The Sumerians struggled to describe this because their world was already filled with intention. Cities are built intentionally. Fields are cultivated intentionally. Social roles are assigned intentionally. To imagine a state before intention required intellectual restraint. The texts reflect this restraint by avoiding verbs that imply purpose. Things do not happen because someone wants them to. They happen because conditions allow them. This approach also affects how time is treated. The primordial state exists outside measurable time, not because time does not exist, but because it has not yet been segmented. There are no days, no nights, no cycles. Time flows, but it is not counted. Later texts will obsess over cycles, calendars, and measurements, but here, time is simply duration. This makes it almost impossible to narrate. Narrative depends on sequence. Without sequence, there is nothing to narrate. So the scribes do not narrate, they describe. Even these descriptions are cautious. They avoid excess detail. Too much specificity would imply boundaries that do not yet exist. Instead, the language remains general, broad, suggestive rather than definitive. This vagueness has often been misread as primitive thinking. In reality, it reflects an awareness of the limits of language. The scribes understood that precision at this stage would be misleading. The primordial state is also characterized by absence of hierarchy. Nothing is above or below anything else. Vertical thinking has not yet taken hold. There is no heaven and earth as separate realms. There is no underworld. There is no between. All of those distinctions emerge later, once separation begins. Before that, everything occupies the same conceptual space. This does not mean everything is identical. It means difference has not yet become structurally important. The Sumerians struggled with this idea because their lived reality was already structured hierarchically. Kings ruled, priests mediated, labour was divided. To imagine a world without hierarchy required them to think against their own experience. Yet they did so. The texts preserve a memory of a state where authority was unnecessary because nothing resisted anything else. Conflict had not yet emerged. There was no friction requiring control. This does not mean the primordial state was idealized as peaceful in a moral sense. It was simply stable. Stability is the key concept here. The primordial state is stable because nothing is competing. Competition requires differentiation. Before differentiation, there is no contest. Later myths will retroactively frame the emergence of order as heroic or necessary. But the earliest material does not portray the primordial state as deficient. It does not need saving. This is why there is no creator figure rushing to fix it. There is no urgency. Change happens slowly, almost reluctantly. The struggle to describe this state is also visible in how the texts handle causation. There is no clear cause for separation. Heaven and earth eventually part, but not because someone decides they should. The separation is described as a fact, not an act. This absence of causation frustrates modern readers who expect explanation. But the Sumerians were not interested in explaining why differentiation occurred. They were interested in preserving the memory that differentiation was not original. This memory is subtle, but it persists beneath later narratives that emphasize divine action. The primordial state also lacks language of ownership. Nothing belongs to anyone. There is no concept of possession. That concept only appears once beings capable of claiming authority appear. This matters because ownership is foundational to later social order. Land is owned, temples are owned, goods are owned. But in the primordial state, ownership has no meaning. The texts reflect this by avoiding possessive constructions. Nothing is described as belonging to a god or a place. Everything simply exists. This again creates difficulty for scribes working within a society obsessed with property, boundaries and rights. Yet the absence is consistent. The primordial state also lacks identity. There are no selves. There is no individuality. This is not because individuality is denied, but because it has not yet emerged as a relevant category. Later myths will focus intensely on individual gods, their rivalries, their decisions, their personalities. None of that exists here. There is nothing to distinguish one force from another. This is perhaps the most challenging aspect for later interpreters. A world without individuals feels empty to us. But to the Sumerians, it was simply earlier. The struggle to describe this state is therefore not a failure of imagination. It is a reflection of intellectual honesty. The scribes did not pretend to understand what could not be fully grasped. They approached it carefully, indirectly, and with restraint. This restraint is visible in how rarely the primordial state is discussed explicitly. It is usually implied rather than detailed. The texts move quickly to later developments because those are easier to describe, but the implication remains. Something existed before the gods, something without names, without hierarchy, without narrative. This something is not erased when gods appear. It remains as the foundation upon which everything else is built. The Sumerians did not forget this. They encoded it in the structure of their myths. Even when gods take center stage, they are always reacting to conditions that pre-exist them. Floods return the world temporarily to this primordial state. Undivided water covers everything. Boundaries dissolve. Hierarchies collapse. This repetition reinforces the idea that the primordial state is not gone. It is always beneath the surface, waiting. This may be why the Sumerians treated floods with such existential seriousness. A flood is not just a disaster. It is a reminder of what lies beneath order. The primordial state is therefore not a mythic abstraction. It is a lived possibility. The struggle to describe it reflects the tension between order and dissolution that defined Sumerian life. They built cities knowing they could be erased. They imposed structure knowing it rested on something older and less controllable. Their texts preserve this awareness. When later readers focus only on gods, councils, and decrees, they miss this deeper layer. The gods operate within a world that is not of their making. The primordial state is that world. It is not hostile. It is not benevolent. It is not intentional. It simply is. The Sumerians struggle to describe it because description itself belongs to the world that comes after. To speak of it at all is already to distort it. And yet they tried. They left us fragments, hints, carefully chosen words that gesture toward a condition they knew they could never fully articulate. This struggle is not a weakness in their tradition. It is one of its most sophisticated features. It shows a culture aware of the limits of language, the limits of authority, and the limits of narrative. Before the Anunnaki, before gods with names, before stories with beginnings and endings, there was a state that could not be ruled, could not be judged, and could not be fully spoken, and that state never truly disappeared. It simply receded, remaining present beneath every structure that would later rise above it. Order without rulers or councils is one of the most quietly radical ideas preserved in the earliest Sumerian material, and it is easy to miss precisely because it is never announced. There is no declaration that authority is absent. There is no argument against leadership. Instead, the texts simply proceed as if order exists naturally, without requiring figures to impose it. This absence is not framed as a problem. It is treated as normal. In the earliest layers of thought, order is not something that must be decided. It is something that emerges from conditions. The world functions because it is arranged in a way that allows it to function, not because someone commands it to do so. This is a fundamentally different understanding of order than the one that dominates later mythological and political systems. When later Sumerian texts describe divine councils, debates among gods, and decrees that shape the fate of humanity, they assume a world that has become crowded, noisy, and unstable. Authority becomes necessary only once complexity introduces conflict. Before that point, the idea of rulers does not arise because there is nothing that needs to be ruled. The earliest worldview preserved in the text reflects a confidence in balance rather than control. Balance does not require decision-making bodies. It requires stability of relationships. As long as those relationships hold, intervention is unnecessary. This is why there are no councils in the primordial phase. Councils exist to resolve disagreement. Disagreement presupposes competing interests. Competing interests require differentiation. Before differentiation, there is no basis for dispute. The Sumerians understood this intuitively. Their environment taught them that systems could regulate themselves up to a point. Rivers flowed without instruction. Seasons followed predictable patterns. Crops grew when conditions were right. Nothing needed to command these processes. They simply occurred. This experiential knowledge shaped how order itself was imagined. Order was not the result of authority. Authority was the result of order breaking down. The texts reflect this by placing councils late in the cosmic sequence. Divine assemblies appear only after gods have distinct roles, personalities, and interests. Once those interests conflict, governance becomes necessary. Before that, there is no reason to gather, debate, or decree. This challenges the assumption that hierarchy is fundamental. In the earliest Sumerian conception, hierarchy is a response, not a foundation. Order without rulers also means that responsibility is distributed rather than centralized. There is no single point of failure. The world does not depend on one will holding everything together. It depends on the consistency of conditions. This type of order is resilient in a different way. It does not collapse when leadership fails, because leadership does not yet exist. It changes only when conditions change. The Sumerians lived in a landscape where centralized control was often impossible. Floods could overwhelm human planning. Droughts could ignore authority entirely. These experiences reinforce the idea that some forms of order operate independently of command. When writing emerges, it reflects this reality. The earliest tablets record processes, not decisions. They track flows of goods, not decrees. They document outcomes, not intentions. This suggests that the earliest sense of order was procedural rather than legislative. Things were done a certain way because that way worked, not because someone said it must be done that way. Later, when kings appear, laws appear with them. Commands are written. Punishments are specified. But before kingship, there is no need to formalize order. Practice is enough. The same logic applies to the divine realm as it is later imagined. Before gods acquire authority, they do not rule. They exist as aspects of the world rather than as managers of it. When later texts speak of gods assigning destinies, enforcing rules, or judging transgressions, they are describing a world that has moved far beyond this earlier phase. The primordial order does not include destiny, judgment, or punishment. This absence is crucial. Without judgment, there is no need for judges. Without law, there is no need for lawmakers. Without hierarchy, there is no need for councils. The Anunnaki, who later become associated with judgment and fate, have no role in this early world. Their function presupposes a moral and social framework that does not yet exist. Order without rulers is not an idealized utopia. It is simply a state where intervention is unnecessary. It does not promise harmony forever. It is temporary by nature. The texts suggest that as the world becomes more differentiated, this kind of order becomes harder to maintain. Separation creates edges. Edges create friction. Friction creates conflict. Conflict demands resolution. But before this process unfolds, order exists quietly. This quiet order is difficult to narrate because narrative thrives on conflict. Without conflict, there is nothing to drive a story forward. This is why later myths focus so heavily on disputes among gods. Those disputes provide momentum. The earliest phase lacks that momentum. It is static in the best sense of the word. Stable. This stability is not passive. It is active equilibrium. Forces counterbalance one another without oversight. Water sustains land. Land absorbs water. Space allows movement. Nothing dominates. This equilibrium mirrors the natural systems the Sumerians depended on. Too much water destroys crops. Too little water causes famine. Balance is survival. It makes sense, then, that the earliest conception of order reflects balance rather than rule. When councils eventually appear in the text, they are portrayed as flawed. Gods argue. Decisions have unintended consequences. Decrees cause suffering. Floods wipe out entire populations. This portrayal suggests an awareness that authority introduces risk. Intervention can stabilize, but it can also destabilize. The primordial order, by contrast, does not make decisions that can go wrong. It simply persists until conditions change. The Sumerians did not romanticize this state as perfect. They understood that it could not support growing complexity. But they did not portray it as chaotic or deficient either. It is simply earlier. This understanding complicates later narratives that frame divine authority as necessary from the beginning. The texts themselves do not support that idea. Authority emerges as a solution to problems that arise later. This has implications for how we understand the Anunnaki. They are not architects of existence. They are administrators of a world that has already become difficult to manage. Their appearance marks the end of order without rulers, not its beginning. Before them, the world does not need councils because there is nothing to deliberate. There are no competing interests, no moral dilemmas, no population pressures. As human society grows, this changes. Cities become crowded, resources become contested, noise increases. Order becomes harder to maintain organically. It is at this point that authority enters both human and divine narratives. Kings mirror gods. Gods mirror kings. Councils mirror assemblies. Law mirrors decree. But beneath all of this, the memory of an earlier order remains. The Sumerians encoded this memory by placing the emergence of authority late in their cosmology. They did not imagine gods ruling from the start. They imagined them stepping into a world that had already reached a breaking point. This framing suggests a sober understanding of power. Power is not inherent, it is reactive. Order without rulers is fragile not because it is weak, but because it cannot adapt indefinitely. It has no mechanism for negotiation. When balance is disrupted, there is no authority to restore it intentionally. This is why the transition to ruled order is inevitable. But inevitability does not imply superiority. The earliest texts preserve the idea that existence can function without oversight. That idea is never fully erased, even when authority becomes dominant. Flood narratives, for example, temporarily remove rulers, councils, and laws. The world returns to water. Boundaries dissolve. Hierarchies vanish. For a brief moment, order without rulers reasserts itself. Not as stability, but as reset. This cyclical return suggests that the primordial state is always present beneath structured order. Authority can suppress it, but not eliminate it. The Sumerians understood this deeply. They lived with the knowledge that cities could be erased overnight, that kings could fall, that gods could withdraw their favour. In that context, remembering a time when order did not depend on rulers was not nostalgia. It was realism. It reminded them that authority is contingent, that it exists only as long as conditions require it. This perspective adds nuance to later divine hierarchies. The Anunnaki are powerful, but they are not eternal in the same way the primordial state is. Their authority depends on circumstances. When circumstances change, their role changes. This is why the earliest phase is not dramatized. There is no triumph in it, no conquest, no decree. There is only arrangement. Arrangement precedes rule. The scribes who preserved these ideas did not elevate this phase above all others. They simply acknowledged it. They allowed it to exist quietly at the foundation of their worldview. This quiet acknowledgement is one of the most sophisticated aspects of Sumerian thought. It shows an awareness that not all order is imposed, and not all stability requires command. Before the Anunnaki, before councils, before judgment, there was order without rulers. It did not speak, it did not decide, it did not intervene. It simply held until holding was no longer enough, and even then it never vanished completely. It remained beneath every decree, every hierarchy, every council chamber, reminding the world that authority is a layer, not the ground itself. When heaven and earth were not yet separate domains, the Sumerian texts describe a condition that feels almost impossible to hold in the modern imagination, not because it is fantastical, but because it lacks the distinctions we rely on to orient ourselves. There is no above and below in the sense we later understand them. There is no realm assigned to authority and another assigned to labour. There is no clear boundary where one domain ends and another begins. Instead, the world exists as a single, continuous field in which what will later be called heaven and earth are still joined, not symbolically, but structurally. This joined state is not presented as a problem that needs to be solved. It is not described as unstable or flawed. It simply exists as the earliest condition the scribes are willing to gesture toward. The difficulty they face is not in imagining this state, but in expressing it without importing later assumptions that would distort it. Later traditions speak easily of heaven above and earth below because separation has become fundamental to how reality is understood. Vertical thinking dominates. Authority comes from above. Labour happens below. The dead go beneath. This structure feels natural to us because we inherit it from millennia of religious and political hierarchy. But the earliest Sumerian material does not begin there. Before separation, there is no vertical order. Not because everything is flat, but because position has not yet acquired meaning. Heaven is not yet a place where decisions are made. Earth is not yet a place where work is done. They are not domains, they are conditions that overlap. This overlap is central. It suggests that the earliest conception of existence was not spatially divided in a way that assigns function or value based on location. There is no implication that what will later be called heaven is superior. Superiority requires distance. Distance has not yet been established. The texts approach this state cautiously. They do not try to describe what it looks like in physical terms. Any such attempt would immediately introduce separation. Instead, they describe it by negation. They tell us what is not yet true. There is not yet a sky that holds back water. There is not yet a ground that resists it. There is not yet a space between where air circulates. These absences matter more than any positive description could. This tells us something important about how the Sumerians thought about beginnings. They did not imagine creation as an act that brings things into existence from nothing. They imagined it as a process that introduces distance into what was once continuous. Heaven and earth are not created separately. They are separated. This distinction cannot be overstated. Creation implies intention. Separation implies transformation. The earliest worldview leans toward transformation. When later texts describe the moment of separation, it is often framed as decisive and even violent, but before that moment, the joined state is not depicted as chaotic. It is simply undivided. In this undivided state, there is no place for authority to stand. Authority requires perspective. It requires a position from which one can look down or issue commands. When heaven and earth are not separate, there is no vantage point. This explains why the earliest phase lacks gods who rule. There is nowhere to rule from. It also explains why later gods are so closely associated with separation itself. Their authority arises from the act of dividing. Once heaven is above and earth is below, hierarchy becomes possible. Before that, everything exists at the same level of reality. The Sumerians struggled with this idea because their lived world was already deeply divided. Cities were separated from fields, temples were elevated above houses, kings stood apart from labourers. To imagine a world without separation required them to step outside their own social reality. Yet the texts preserve that memory. They do so indirectly, through metaphors of closeness and fusion rather than explicit statements. Heaven and earth are said to be together, not married in a symbolic sense, but joined as one mass. This language is careful. It avoids romanticizing the state. It does not imply affection or harmony. It implies proximity. Proximity is neutral. It simply means no distance exists. In this condition, there is no space for movement. Movement requires distance. Without distance, there is only presence. This has implications for how time is experienced. When heaven and earth are joined, there is no day and night. There is no cycle of light and darkness. Those cycles depend on separation, on the movement of celestial bodies relative to a fixed ground. Without that distinction, time has no rhythm. The primordial state is therefore timeless, not because time does not exist, but because it has no markers. This absence of markers is reflected in the texts. They do not count, they do not measure, they do not sequence. All of that appears later, once separation allows repetition to be observed. The Sumerians were keen observers of cycles. Their calendars were sophisticated. Their astronomy was precise. But that precision belongs to a later world. The earliest phase is intentionally imprecise. This imprecision is not ignorance. It is appropriate to the subject. The joined state also lacks identity. Heaven is not yet a god. Earth is not yet a goddess. Those identities come later, once separation allows personification. You cannot personify what has no boundaries. This is why the earliest references avoid names. Naming would imply distinction that does not yet exist. Later traditions often read these early passages as mythic metaphors for physical events, but that reading misses the philosophical depth of what is being expressed. These Sumerians were not trying to describe a geological process. They were articulating a model of reality in which differentiation is the origin of order. Before differentiation there is no order, because order implies arrangement. Arrangement requires parts. The joined state has no parts. This does not mean it is disordered. It means it is preordered. This concept appears again and again in subtle ways. When later myths describe catastrophic floods, they often emphasize the return to undivided water. Heaven's boundaries collapse. Earth's solidity fails. The world briefly returns to a state resembling this primordial unity. Floods are terrifying not only because they destroy, but because they erase distinctions. They remind humans that separation is temporary. The Sumerians lived with this reminder constantly. Their cities were built on floodplains. Their boundaries were redrawn repeatedly. The memory of a time when heaven and earth were not separate was not abstract. It was echoed every time the rivers overflowed. This lived experience reinforces the plausibility of the joined state. It is not a fantasy. It is an extrapolation from observed reality. The earliest texts do not say that heaven and earth were intentionally joined. They say they were together. There is no motive, no plan, no desire. It simply was. This lack of intention is key. It means that separation is not framed as correction of a mistake. It is framed as a change in conditions. Later myths will moralize this change. They will describe conflict, decision, and authority. But the earliest phase is morally neutral. Heaven and earth being together is not good or bad. It is simply earlier. This perspective allows the Sumerians to acknowledge that hierarchy is not eternal. It emerges. That means it could, in theory, recede. This idea may explain why later texts are often ambivalent about authority. Gods make mistakes, kings fail, councils argue. None of these institutions are portrayed as perfect or timeless. They are necessary responses to separation, not ultimate truths. The joined state represents a world where necessity has not yet arisen. In that world, there is no labour because there is no scarcity. Labour emerges once resources become unevenly distributed. That distribution depends on separation. There is also no communication. Communication requires distance between entities. When everything is continuous, nothing needs to be communicated. This again frustrates modern expectations. We expect speech, command, instruction. But none of that exists yet. The Anunnaki, when they later appear as judges and determiners of fate, rely entirely on separation. Fate presupposes distinct lives. Judgment presupposes boundaries between right and wrong. None of that is possible when heaven and earth are one. So before they appear, the world cannot be judged. This absence of judgment is not framed as innocence. It is framed as irrelevance. Judgment does not apply yet. The scribes were aware that this state could not last. They do not attempt to preserve it indefinitely. They move forward. But they do so without erasing it. They allow the memory of unity to remain beneath later divisions. This memory is what gives later separations their weight. Separation is not trivial because something was lost. Not perfection, but continuity. Once heaven and earth separate, space opens, air appears, movement becomes possible. With movement comes interaction. With interaction comes conflict. With conflict comes authority. This sequence is consistent throughout the tradition. The joined state is therefore not a mythic curiosity. It is the foundation of the entire cosmological model. Without it, later developments make no sense. The Sumerians understood that authority only makes sense in a divided world. They did not project authority backward into the beginning. This restraint is one of the most striking features of their thought. They allowed the beginning to remain simple, not because it was primitive, but because complexity had not yet emerged. When heaven and earth were not yet separate domains, the world did not need explanation. It did not need governance. It did not need judgment. It simply existed as a single continuous reality. That reality did not vanish when separation occurred. It was transformed, and traces of it remain visible in every later myth, every flood story, every moment when boundaries fail and the world reminds itself of what it was like before division became the rule rather than the exception. As the texts move forward, separation will bring clarity, structure, and authority, but it will also bring vulnerability, because once heaven and earth are apart, they can collide again, and the memory of their original closeness never fully disappears. Forces that preceded names and faces occupy a strange position in the Sumerian texts, because they are acknowledged without ever being fully defined. They are present, but they are not introduced. They act, but they are not described as actors. The scribes refer to them not as beings, but as conditions that later beings emerge from. This is one of the clearest indications that the earlier Sumerian worldview didn't begin with personalities, but with dynamics. Before names appear, before identities solidify, there is already movement. Not movement from one place to another, but movement as change of state. Water shifts, density changes, space opens. None of this is attributed to intention. It simply occurs. The texts preserve this by refusing to assign these changes to named agents. This refusal is consistent. When later gods are named, their names carry function. They mean something. They indicate domain, responsibility, lineage. Before that stage, naming would be misleading. To name something is to imply that it can be isolated from its surroundings. The forces described here cannot be isolated. They only exist in relation to everything else. This is why the earliest texts rely on verbs and descriptors rather than nouns. They describe what happens, not who does it. Even then, the verbs are often passive or ambiguous. Things come into being, things separate, things settle, The language avoids agency. This avoidance is not a limitation of the script. It is a choice. The scribes understood that the moment they introduced faces, they would impose hierarchy. Faces look at one another. They judge. They command. They desire. None of that belongs to this phase. The forces that precede names are not moral. They are not conscious in the way later gods are. They do not care. They do not decide. They do not plan. They function. This functional existence is difficult to grasp precisely because later traditions overwrite it. When gods acquire faces, everything that follows is interpreted through personality. Events become reactions. Outcomes become consequences. Before that shift, events are simply transitions. The Sumerians struggled to preserve this distinction because their own society was already saturated with names and faces. Kings had names, cities had names, temples had names, even tools and measurements were standardized and labeled. To imagine a world without names required a deliberate act of abstraction. Yet the texts manage it. They do so by describing forces through their effects rather than their essence. Water nourishes, water destroys, space allows, space separates, ground supports, ground resists. None of these are beings, they are interactions. This interaction-based worldview suggests that the earliest Sumerians understood reality as relational rather than personal. What mattered was not who something was, but what it did in relation to other things. This becomes especially clear when later gods are introduced as embodiments of these same forces. A god of water appears, but water existed long before that god was named. A god of sky appears, but the sky existed long before it was personified. The god does not create the force. The god represents it. This sequence is often reversed in later retellings. Modern narratives tend to assume that gods create their domains. The Sumerian material suggests the opposite. Domains come first. Gods follow. The forces that precede names are therefore more fundamental than any deity. They are not subordinate to divine will. Divine will emerges as a way of interacting with them. This perspective reframes the entire pantheon. Gods are not originators, they are interfaces. The Anunnaki in particular belong firmly to the stage where names and faces dominate. They are judges. They sit, they look, they speak, they issue decrees. None of that is possible without individuality. So before them, there must be a world that operates without individuality. This world is not empty of power. On the contrary, it is saturated with it. But the power is diffuse. It is everywhere at once. It does not concentrate. Concentration is what produces faces. Once power concentrates, it can be personified. Once personified, it can be named. Before concentration, power remains anonymous. The Sumerian texts reflect this anonymity through their lack of genealogies at this stage. Later myths obsess over lineage. Who is born from whom? Who descends from which god? None of that exists yet. Birth itself has not yet become a narrative device. This suggests that the earliest phase is not concerned with origin stories, because origin implies separation. Something comes from something else. Before separation there is no origin. Instead, there is continuity. The forces that precede names are continuous. They do not begin. They do not end. They transform. This transformational view aligns closely with the Sumerian experience of their environment. The rivers they depended on did not have clear beginnings or endings within their world. They flowed from distant mountains they would never see, and emptied into seas they would rarely visit. Water appeared, moved, and disappeared without visible cause. Wind behaved the same way. It came from nowhere, altered conditions, and vanished. Heat rose and fell. Light changed. None of these phenomena needed explanation in terms of beings. They were experienced directly. The Sumerians did not initially imagine someone controlling the wind. They experienced wind as a condition. Only later did it become associated with a god. And this progression from force to face is gradual. The texts preserve that gradualness by delaying personification. When personification finally occurs, it is never complete. Even named gods retain aspects of their original anonymity. They are inconsistent, they overlap, their roles blur. This reflects their origin in forces that were never fully separable. The struggle to fully define gods later on is a residue of this earlier phase. Gods are never perfectly bounded. They intrude on one another's domains. They conflict. They change roles. This instability reflects their derivation from forces that were never meant to be isolated. The forces that precede names therefore continue to exert influence even after names appear. They cannot be fully contained by identity. This is why disasters in Sumerian mythology often feel impersonal. Floods are not punishments in the earliest versions. They are overwhelming conditions. Later texts will moralize them, but the underlying event remains force-driven. The gods may decide to send a flood, but the flood itself behaves according to forces that do not care about decisions. Water spreads, boundaries dissolve, structures collapse. No god micromanages that process. This reveals a layered understanding of causation. Divine decision initiates events, but natural forces determine their outcome. Before gods, there is only the latter. This layered model suggests that the Sumerians did not see divine power as absolute. It is influential, but not omnipotent. Gods work with forces rather than commanding them entirely. This again undermines later interpretations that portray the Anunnaki as supreme controllers. The texts do not support that image. They show gods navigating a world that has its own momentum. Before gods acquire names and faces, that momentum is all there is. The Sumerians struggled to describe this because language itself pushes toward naming. To speak is to categorize. To categorize is to separate. The scribes were aware of this tension. They navigated it by speaking obliquely, by describing effects rather than sources, by using general terms rather than specific ones. This obliqueness has frustrated later readers who want clarity. But clarity at this stage would be false. The primordial forces are not meant to be clear. They are meant to be foundational. This foundation explains why later myths are so concerned with maintaining order. Order is not guaranteed. It emerges temporarily from forces that are fundamentally indifferent. The gods arise as managers of that emergence. They are not creators of the forces themselves. This managerial role becomes increasingly explicit as the pantheon develops. Gods assign duties. They enforce boundaries. They judge behavior. All of this presupposes forces that could otherwise destabilize the system. The Anunnaki, as judges of fate, represent the culmination of this process. Fate is an attempt to impose predictability on a world governed by impersonal forces. Before fate, there is contingency. Things happen because conditions align. The earliest worldview accepts contingency. It does not attempt to eliminate it. Later worldviews struggle against it. This struggle produces narrative, law, and authority. The forces that precede names are therefore not merely historical curiosities. They are the baseline reality against which all later structures are built. The Sumerians did not erase this baseline. They layered over it. Even when gods dominate the narrative, traces of the earlier force-based worldview remain. Gods argue because outcomes are uncertain. They fail because forces exceed their control. They retreat because conditions change. These inconsistencies are not flaws in the mythology. They are echoes of a deeper truth preserved in the earliest material. That truth is simple, but not comforting. Before faces, before names, before judgment, there was power without personality. It moved, it shifted, it transformed. It did not explain itself. It did not need to. And when names finally appear, they do not replace these forces. They merely give them a shape that humans can speak about. The forces remain beneath the faces. They always have. They are what existed before the Anunnaki, and what continued to exist after them, regardless of how many names were given, how many councils were formed, or how many decrees were issued. Because no matter how elaborate the hierarchy becomes, it still rests on a foundation that has no face, no voice, and no concern for authority. It simply acts. And that action is the oldest thing the Sumerian texts remember. Creation without intervention or dissent is one of the most easily misunderstood aspects of the earlier Sumerian worldview, because it contradicts the expectations shaped by later mythological traditions. We are accustomed to imagining creation as something that happens because someone acts. A god speaks, a being descends, a will imposes itself on emptiness. But the earlier Sumerian texts do not describe creation this way. They do not begin with a figure arriving from elsewhere to initiate existence. They describe creation as something that unfolds internally, without intrusion, without command, and without an external agent stepping in to make it happen. This distinction matters because it reframes creation not as an event, but as a process. The world does not begin because it is intervened upon. It begins because conditions within it change. There is no outside force crossing a boundary, because at this stage, there is no boundary to cross. In the earliest material, creation is not a solution to a problem. It is not a response to lack, chaos, or disorder. It is simply differentiation emerging from continuity. Something becomes distinguishable, where before it was not. That is the only sense in which creation occurs. Later myths will speak of gods intervening to correct imbalance, to impose order, to solve crises. But those stories belong to a world that already exists, a world that has grown complex enough to require management. The earliest phase does not require correction. There is nothing wrong that needs fixing. This is why there is no dissent. Dissent implies elevation. It assumes a higher realm and a lower one. It assumes separation has already occurred. But creation precedes separation. Before heaven and earth part, there is no above to descend from and no below to descend into. The Sumerians understood this, and their texts reflect it. The language used in the earliest compositions avoids verbs associated with coming down, arriving, or entering. Those verbs appear later, once realms have been established. At the beginning, there is no movement between levels, because levels do not yet exist. Instead of descent, there is emergence. Emergence is quieter. It does not draw attention to itself. It does not announce intention. It happens because conditions allow it to happen. This way of thinking aligns closely with how the Sumerians experienced creation in their own lives. Crops did not grow because someone intervened at the right moment. They grew because water, soil, and time aligned. Human effort mattered, but effort alone could not force growth. Creation was cooperative, not imposed. This cooperative model is projected backward into the earliest cosmology. The world is not commanded into being. It comes into being because relationships stabilize enough for form to appear. This is also why the earliest texts do not portray creation as complete. It is not finished. It does not culminate in a perfect state. Creation continues as long as conditions continue to shift. Later myths will frame creation as a concluded act, something that happened once and then ended. But the earliest worldview does not support that framing. Creation is ongoing. The absence of intervention also means there is no creator figure standing apart from what is created. There is no separation between maker and made. Everything that exists emerges from the same continuity. This undermines the idea of control at the beginning. If no one intervenes, then no one directs outcomes. Creation unfolds without supervision. This is unsettling to later traditions that depend on authority. Authority requires someone to be in charge. But the earliest phase does not accommodate that idea. The Sumerians were not uncomfortable with this lack of control. They lived in a world where control was always partial. Floods ignored human planning. Droughts ignored effort. Disease ignored status. Creation without intervention reflected reality. This worldview also avoids attributing blame. If creation is not the result of intervention, then failure is not someone's fault. There is no creator to accuse. There is no decision to question. Later myths will struggle with this. They will introduce gods who make mistakes, whose decisions cause suffering. But before that, suffering is simply a consequence of conditions. The earliest texts do not moralize creation. They do not frame it as good or bad. It simply occurs. This neutrality is important. It suggests that existence is not oriented toward human benefit at the outset. Humans are not the goal of creation. In fact, humans do not appear until much later, and when they do, they are created for practical reasons, not because existence was waiting for them. Creation without intervention also means there is no urgency. Nothing needs to happen quickly. There is no crisis driving creation forward. Things take shape gradually. This gradualness is reflected in the way the texts move forward. There is no sudden shift from nothing to something. There is a slow accumulation of distinction. Water becomes distinguishable from land. Space becomes distinguishable from matter. Time becomes distinguishable through repetition. None of this requires a decision. It requires stability. The earliest worldview values stability above all else. Stability allows creation to proceed. Instability disrupts it. Later myths will frame instability as a moral problem. Early thought frames it as a condition. This difference explains why the earliest phase lacks heroes. There is nothing heroic about stability. It does not require bravery or sacrifice, it simply persists. Heroic narratives appear once instability becomes common. Once creation requires protection, defenders emerge. But before that, there is no role for them. The Anunnaki, who later appear as judges and enforcers, belong to a world where creation has already produced complexity. They intervene because intervention has become necessary. Before them, intervention would be pointless. This does not mean that creation is passive. It is active in its own way. Forces interact, conditions shift, patterns form. But none of this is framed as intentional action. The Sumerians recognized that not all action is purposeful. Some change is simply emergent. This recognition is one of the most sophisticated aspects of their thought. It resists the temptation to explain everything in terms of will. Later traditions would struggle to maintain this restraint. As society became more hierarchical, it became harder to imagine order without command. Authority became central. Gods became rulers. But the earliest texts preserve a memory of a time when order did not require rule, and creation did not require intervention. This memory complicates later narratives that depict gods as engineers or planners. The Sumerian material does not support the idea of gods arriving to build the world. It suggests that the world was already in the process of forming when gods later appeared. This has direct implications for how we understand descent narratives. When gods descend in later myths, they are not initiating existence. They are entering an existing system. Their descent is therefore not creative. It is administrative. This distinction is often lost in modern interpretations that conflate divine presence with origin. The Sumerian texts keep these ideas separate. Creation without descent also means there is no chosen location, no sacred landing place, no center where existence begins. The world does not radiate outward from a point of arrival. Instead, creation is distributed. It happens everywhere at once, because it is a changing condition, not a localized event. This distributed model aligns with the Sumerian understanding of floods. When floodwaters rise, they do not come from one place. They emerge everywhere. Boundaries dissolve simultaneously. Creation and destruction occur across the landscape at once. The primordial state behaves similarly. Differentiation happens across the whole, not at a single site. This further undermines narratives that seek to locate origins in specific places or events. The earliest worldview is spatially indifferent. There is no center because everything is continuous. Centers appear later, once separation allows focal points to emerge. Cities become centers. Temples become centers. Thrones become centers. Before that, there is no reason to privilege one location over another. This lack of centrality also means there is no audience for creation. Nothing is watching it happen. There is no witness to record the moment. Creation is not a performance. This explains why the earliest texts do not dramatize creation. There is no spectacle. There is nothing to see. The scribes who later recorded these ideas did so retrospectively. They were not eyewitnesses to creation. They were inheritors of a conceptual memory. That memory told them that creation was not something that happened to the world. It was something the world did. This self-creative quality is subtle. It does not imply consciousness. It implies capacity. The world has the capacity to differentiate itself. Later gods will be given credit for this differentiation, but the earliest material suggests that credit is misplaced. Gods emerge within a differentiated world. They do not bring differentiation into existence from outside. This perspective strips creation of drama, but not of depth. It portrays existence as something that unfolds according to its own logic. The Sumerians accepted this logic without trying to dominate it. Their later myths show gods attempting to manage the consequences of creation, not to initiate it. This is why creation myths are often followed immediately by management myths. Once humans exist, labour must be assigned. Once cities exist, order must be enforced. Once noise exists, population must be controlled. These are responses to creation, not acts of creation themselves. Creation without intervention leaves no one in charge. That is its defining feature. As soon as someone takes charge, creation gives way to governance. The Anunnaki represent that shift. They do not create. They judge. They determine fate. They respond to the world as it has become. Before them there is no fate to determine. Fate presupposes lives that can be shaped. Lives presuppose creation that has already occurred. This sequence is consistent. The earliest worldview does not imagine beings descending to fix a broken world. It imagines a world that gradually becomes complex enough to require fixing. Creation is therefore innocent of intention. It is not benevolent. It is not malevolent. It simply happens. This idea is uncomfortable because it removes meaning from the beginning. Meaning appears later, once humans and gods begin to interpret what exists. But the Sumerians were not afraid of this discomfort. They preserved it. They allowed creation to remain quiet, unclaimed, and unowned. This is why the earliest phase resists being turned into a story. There is no plot, there is no hero, there is no intervention, there is only emergence, and that emergence sets the stage for everything that follows without ever announcing itself as the beginning. Because in this worldview the beginning is not a moment, it is a condition, and conditions do not arrive, they simply take shape. Why the texts begin earlier than expected is not because the Sumerians were trying to be mysterious or deliberately obscure, but because their understanding of beginnings did not align with later expectations about where a story should start. Modern readers instinctively look for a clear opening moment, a first action, a decisive event that marks the start of everything that follows. The Sumerian texts resist this instinct. They begin earlier because, in their worldview, beginning is not synonymous with action. What surprises many readers is not that the texts talk about primordial conditions, but that they do so without urgency. They do not rush toward gods, creation of humans, or the establishment of order. They linger in states that feel preparatory, almost background-like, as if the world itself needs to be understood before anything meaningful can happen within it. This is intentional. The scribes were not constructing a dramatic arc. They were preserving a layered understanding of reality. The earliest Sumerian texts begin where later traditions would not even think to look. They begin before intention, before authority, before identity. This feels counterintuitive because we're used to stories that centre on agents. We expect beginnings to involve someone doing something. But the Sumerians did not assume that agency was fundamental. They assumed that condition was. This is why the texts open with descriptions that feel static. They are not static because nothing matters yet. They are static because what matters is not yet active. The groundwork has to be acknowledged before action can be understood. The scribes knew that once gods appear, everything changes, language shifts, power enters, decisions are made, consequences follow. To understand those later developments properly, the listener or reader needs to understand what existed before those shifts took place. Without that context, later stories would seem arbitrary. By beginning earlier than expected, the texts establish that authority is not original. It emerges. That single idea shapes the entire cosmology. If the texts began with gods already ruling, then divine authority would appear natural and inevitable. By starting earlier, the Sumerians subtly undermine that assumption. They show that the world existed without rulers first, and only later required them. This approach reflects how Sumerian society itself developed. Cities did not appear fully formed with kings and laws. They grew gradually. Leadership structures evolved. Roles became formalized over time. The scribes projected this lived experience backward into their understanding of the cosmos. They did not imagine the universe as a finished system dropped into place. They imagined it as something that developed complexity over time. This developmental perspective explains why the earlier sections of the texts feel sparse. They are not incomplete, they are appropriately minimal. Too much detail would suggest too much structure too early. The Sumerians were careful not to impose later categories onto earlier conditions. They resisted the temptation to retroactively explain everything in terms of gods and decisions. Instead, they allowed the earliest phase to remain vague, not because they lacked clarity, but because clarity would be misleading. This restraint is one of the most sophisticated aspects of their thought. The texts begin earlier than expected because they are not myths in the modern sense. They are records of how reality is layered. Myths, as we often understand them, focus on meaning. These texts focus first on existence. Meaning comes later. This is why the earliest passages are difficult to summarize. They do not tell you what to believe. They do not announce lessons. They describe a state of affairs and move on. Later traditions, especially those influenced by monotheistic frameworks, often compress beginnings into a single moment of creation. One command, one act, one decisive separation between nothing and something. The Sumerian texts refuse this compression. They suggest that nothing and something are not separated by a single boundary. They bleed into one another. This bleeding makes it necessary to begin earlier, because there is no clear threshold where creation suddenly happens. The scribes understood that if they started too late, everything that followed would be misunderstood. Gods would appear to be creators rather than administrators. Authority would appear inherent rather than responsive. Judgment would appear necessary rather than circumstantial. By starting earlier, they prevent this misunderstanding. This choice also reflects a deep awareness of how narratives shape belief. The scribes knew that where you begin determines how everything else is interpreted. Beginning with gods would elevate them beyond question. Beginning before gods places them within a larger context. This larger context is not meant to diminish the gods. It is meant to situate them. The Anunnaki, when they appear later, are powerful. But they are not foundational. They operate within a world that has already taken shape. This distinction matters. Modern interpretations that focus exclusively on divine arrival often miss this because they begin reading too late. They start where names appear, not where conditions are established. The Sumerian texts themselves caution against this by their structure. They insist on groundwork. This groundwork is not philosophical speculation detached from reality. It mirrors practical experience. In Sumerian life, nothing important happened suddenly. Canals took time to dig. Fields took seasons to yield crops. Cities took generations to build. Stability emerged slowly. The cosmos, in their view, followed the same pattern. The decision to begin earlier than expected is therefore not abstract. It is consistent with how the Sumerians understood process itself. They did not trust sudden origins. This distrust is visible in how they treat kingship. Even when kingship is described as descending from heaven, it does not immediately result in stable rule. Early kings have absurdly long reigns, suggesting mythic time rather than practical governance. Only later do reigns become shorter and more realistic, aligning with human experience. This gradual alignment reinforces the idea that authority becomes meaningful only after the world has matured enough to require it. The texts begin early because they want to show that maturity. They want to show that complexity builds. This also explains why the earliest texts are so difficult to categorize. They are not theology, they are not history, they are not philosophy in the later sense. They are something in between. They are attempts to articulate how reality transitions from undifferentiated existence to structured society. That transition cannot be captured if you start too late. Beginning earlier than expected also serves another purpose. It protects the earliest phase from appropriation by later agendas. By keeping it vague and unclaimed, the scribes prevent any single god or authority from asserting ownership over existence itself. No deity can say, "This is my creation," because creation is not framed as an act that can be claimed. This has implications for power. It subtly limits divine authority by denying it ultimate origin status. Later gods may rule, judge, and decide, but they do not own the beginning. This limitation is never stated outright. It does not need to be. It is embedded in the structure of the texts. The earliest phase is beyond ownership. This may explain why later myths often struggle with the question of ultimate authority. Gods argue, councils debate. Decisions are reversed or circumvented. Authority is never absolute. That instability traces back to the fact that authority is not original. It is layered. By beginning earlier than expected, the texts preserve this layered reality. They also preserve a sense of humility. Humans are not central at the beginning. Gods are not central either. The world does not revolve around intention or purpose. It exists first. Only later do beings begin to ask what it means. This sequence is important. Meaning emerges from existence, not the other way around. Modern readers often reverse this. We assume meaning must come first. The Sumerian texts suggest otherwise. They begin early to show that meaning is secondary. This does not make the later myths meaningless. It makes them contextual. The gods are meaningful because they respond to a world that has already become complex. Humans are meaningful because they participate in that complexity. But neither defines existence itself. The texts begin earlier than expected because the scribes wanted to make this distinction clear, even if they did not articulate it explicitly. They trusted structure to communicate what explanation could not. This structural choice has consequences. It slows the narrative. It resists easy summary. It demands patience. That patience mirrors the worldview being described. The earliest phase is not dramatic because it does not need to be. Drama belongs to later stages, when things can go wrong. By beginning earlier, the texts ensure that when drama arrives, it is understood as a consequence of development, not as the essence of existence. This has a sobering effect. It frames conflict as something that arises with complexity, not as something built into reality from the start. The Sumerians lived with conflict. They did not deny it. But they did not project it backward into the beginning. They allowed the beginning to be quiet. That quiet beginning is easy to overlook, but it is deliberate. It tells us that the world was not created to serve anyone. It was not designed for gods or humans. It simply became. Everything that follows, including authority, judgment, and fate, is layered on top of that becoming. This is why the texts begin earlier than expected. They are not trying to tell the most exciting story. They are trying to tell the most accurate one, according to their understanding. And accuracy in this case requires starting before the point where names, power, and purpose enter the scene. Because once those appear, it becomes much harder to remember that there was a time when none of them were necessary. By beginning early, the Sumerians ensured that this memory would not be lost. even as later generations focused more and more on gods, kings, and the structures that governed their lives. The beginning, in their view, was not something to celebrate or dramatize. It was something to acknowledge quietly, and then move forward from, without ever forgetting that it came first. The difference between origin and authority is one of the most carefully preserved distinctions in the Sumerian texts, even though it is rarely stated directly. It is implied through structure, sequencing, and omission rather than explanation. The scribes did not pause to define these terms or argue for their separation. They simply treated them as different things. Origin belongs to the earliest state of existence. Authority belongs to what comes later. The two are not interchangeable, and the texts never confuse them. This distinction is subtle because later traditions often collapse it. When authority becomes powerful enough, it claims origin. Rulers say they were chosen at the beginning. Gods say they created what they govern. Power tends to reach backward and rewrite the past in its own image. The Sumerian texts resist this impulse. They allow authority to emerge without allowing it to become foundational. In the earliest phase, nothing governs. There is no decision-making force. There is no command structure. Existence is not directed. It simply exists. That state is treated as origin, even though it lacks intention, plan, or purpose. Origin, in this worldview, is not an act. It is a condition. Authority, by contrast, is always active. It decides. It intervenes. It enforces. The moment authority appears in the texts, the tone changes. Speech becomes important. Decrees are issued. Boundaries are set. Consequences are imposed. None of this exists at the origin. The texts preserve this separation by introducing authority only after differentiation has occurred. Once heaven and earth are distinct, once forces begin to take shape, once roles become necessary, authority enters as a response to complexity. It is never portrayed as the cause of existence itself. This sequencing matters. It tells us that authority is not necessary for existence to begin. It becomes necessary only once existence becomes crowded, structured, and vulnerable to imbalance. The Sumerians understood authority as something that manages, not something that generates. This is why even the most powerful gods are never depicted as absolute creators in the earliest layers. They are organizers, assigners, regulators. They step into a world that already has substance. This worldview reflects lived experience. In Sumerian society, authority did not appear out of nothing. Villages existed before kings. Cooperation existed before law. Customs existed before decrees. Authority emerged to formalize what was already happening. The scribes projected this understanding onto the cosmos. They did not imagine a god inventing the world from nothing and then ruling it. They imagined a world forming and then being governed once governance became necessary. This has profound implications for how power is understood. If authority is not original, then it is not absolute. It is conditional. It exists because circumstances demand it, not because it is inherently required. The texts reinforce this by showing authority repeatedly failing. Gods argue. Decisions have unintended consequences. Decrees are circumvented. Authority is shown to be powerful but not infallible. If authority were identical with origin, failure would be impossible. The world would reflect perfect intention. The Sumerian texts do not present such a world. Instead, they present a world where authority struggles to keep pace with the consequences of existence. This struggle is visible in flood narratives, population control measures, and divine disputes. Authority reacts. It does not anticipate everything. This reactive quality reveals that authority is layered on top of a reality it did not design. The Anunnaki exemplify this. They are judges. They determine fate. They enforce outcomes. But they do not create the conditions they judge. They respond to them. Judgment presupposes a world that can be judged. Fate presupposes lives that unfold unpredictably. Authority presupposes resistance. Origin contains none of these things. This is why the earliest phase lacks morality. Morality requires authority. Someone must decide what is right or wrong. Before authority, there is no right or wrong. There is only alignment or misalignment of conditions. The Sumerians were comfortable with this idea. They did not insist on moralizing the beginning. They allowed the beginning to remain neutral. Later traditions would struggle with this neutrality. They would feel compelled to insert purpose, intention, and moral direction into the origin itself. The Sumerian texts do not. They maintain a clear boundary. Origin explains how existence comes to be. Authority explains how existence is managed. These explanations are not interchangeable. This separation is also evident in how the texts treat names. Names appear with authority, not with origin. Naming is an act of control. To name something is to fix it within a system. Before authority, naming is unnecessary. This is why the primordial state lacks names and faces. Origin does not need identification. Authority does. When gods are named, they are already embedded in relationships of power. Their names define their domains, their responsibilities, their rank. The Anunnaki's name itself refers to lineage and status. It implies hierarchy. That hierarchy does not exist at the origin. This means the Anunnaki cannot belong to the origin phase by definition. Their very identity presupposes authority. The texts are consistent on this point, even when later retellings blur the line. The difference between origin and authority also explains why the earliest phase resists narrative. Narrative depends on agency. Agency depends on authority. Origin lacks both. Once authority appears, narrative becomes possible. Conflicts can occur, decisions can be made, consequences can unfold. This is why later myths are rich with story, while the earliest material is sparse. The Sumerians did not mistake sparsity for insignificance. They understood that origin does not announce itself. Authority announces itself loudly. Origin does not. This understanding may be why the scribes were so careful in how they structured their texts. They did not allow authority to claim the beginning, they placed it firmly later. This placement subtly limits authority's claim over existence. Gods can rule the present. They cannot own the beginning. This limitation has ethical implications. If authority is not original, then it is not sacred in itself. It must justify itself by its effectiveness. The Sumerian gods are judged by their outcomes. When authority causes excessive suffering, it is questioned, resisted, or circumvented. Enki's actions during the flood narrative are a clear example. Authority decrees destruction. Wisdom intervenes. This intervention is possible only because authority is not absolute. If authority were identical with origin, resistance would be meaningless. But because authority is layered, resistance becomes possible. This layered model creates a dynamic divine world rather than a static one. Gods negotiate. They compromise. They fail. This dynamic reflects human political reality. Kings negotiate with councils. Laws are revised. Power shifts. The Sumerians did not imagine a cosmos radically different from their own society. They imagined it as an extension of the same principles operating at a larger scale. Origin, however, remains outside this dynamic. It does not negotiate. It does not change its mind. It does not intervene. This is why the origin phase feels distant and impersonal. It is not meant to be interacted with. Authority, by contrast, is deeply interactive. It speaks, it listens, it responds. The distinction between these two phases prevents confusion. It allows the Sumerians to explain suffering without blaming existence itself. Suffering arises from decisions made within a complex world, not from the fact that the world exists. This is a remarkably sober position. It avoids both nihilism and fatalism. Existence is not cruel. Authority can be. This perspective also explains why the texts are so cautious about divine power. Gods are powerful, but they are not ultimate. They can be wrong. They can be challenged. The Anunnaki's role as judges does not make them creators. It makes them enforcers. Enforcement is always secondary to existence. The Sumerians did not confuse these levels. They understood that the rules governing a system are not the same as the conditions that allow the system to exist. Modern readers often conflate these levels, especially when reading through later religious frameworks that emphasize absolute creation by a single authority. The Sumerian texts do not support that model. They support a layered reality in which origin is impersonal and authority is personal. This layered reality makes room for change. Authority can evolve. Systems can be revised. Existence remains. This may be why the Sumerians place such emphasis on continuity. Dynasties fall, cities are destroyed, gods change roles. But the world persists. Floods erase authority temporarily. The world returns to a more primordial state. When the waters recede, authority re-emerges in modified form. This cycle reinforces the idea that authority is temporary and conditional, while origin is persistent. The texts encode this lesson repeatedly without stating it explicitly. They do so by beginning early, delaying authority, and never allowing it to fully claim the foundation. This is not accidental. It reflects a deep understanding of power and its limits. The Sumerians lived under kings. They served gods. They obeyed laws. But they also knew that none of these things were eternal. By preserving the difference between origin and authority, they preserved a space where power could be questioned, even if only indirectly. This questioning is not rebellious. It is structural. The texts do not argue against authority. They contextualize it. Authority belongs to a world that has already moved beyond its beginning. It is necessary, but not sacred in itself. Origin, by contrast, is not moral, not intentional, not owned. It simply is. And because it is not owned, it cannot be commanded. This realization underlies much of the quiet tension in Sumerian mythology. Gods attempt to control outcomes, but they never fully succeed. The world pushes back. This pushback is not rebellion. It is the residue of origin asserting itself beneath authority. The Sumerians did not name this concept, but they preserved it. They understood that no matter how elaborate governance becomes, it rests on something that cannot be governed. That something existed before the Anunnaki. It existed before councils, before decrees, before judgment, and it continues to exist beneath them, shaping the limits of what authority can achieve. The difference between origin and authority is therefore not a philosophical abstraction. It is the foundation of the entire cosmological system. Without it, the myths collapse into contradictions. With it, the world makes sense as a place where power exists but is never ultimate, where order is imposed but not absolute, where existence precedes rule and survives it. And that difference, once recognized, changes how every later story is understood without needing to be stated again. How later gods enter an already functioning world is one of the clearest indicators that the Sumerian texts were never meant to present divinity as the starting point of existence. When gods finally appear as named figures with defined roles, they do not arrive into emptiness. They do not step into chaos that needs to be shaped from nothing. They enter a world that already operates, already changes, already sustains itself through patterns that predate their authority. Their presence marks a transition, not an origin. This transition is handled carefully in the texts. The scribes do not describe gods bursting into existence or descending dramatically from a distant realm. Instead, gods emerge gradually as differentiation becomes necessary. They appear when functions need to be stabilized, when forces that once operated anonymously begin to require representation, mediation, and management. This timing is not accidental. It reflects an understanding that divinity arises in response to complexity rather than preceding it. The world the gods enter is already structured by relationships. Water flows, land supports growth, space allows movement, time begins to show rhythm. None of this is initiated by gods. It is already happening. The gods step into these processes as organizers, not creators. This is why the earliest named gods are closely associated with domains rather than acts of creation. A god of water does not invent water. A god of sky does not bring the sky into being. These gods are assigned to oversee, regulate, and personify aspects of reality that already exist. Their authority is managerial. This managerial role is consistent across the tradition. Even the most powerful gods are described as allocating responsibilities, setting boundaries, and resolving disputes. They do not generate the fundamental conditions they govern. They work within them. The texts emphasize this by showing gods inheriting domains rather than claiming them. Heaven, earth, and the space between are already present when gods are assigned to them. The assignment is a response to the need for coordination, not an act of creation. This distinction is crucial because it prevents divine authority from becoming absolute. Gods are powerful, but their power is limited by the structure of the world they enter. They cannot undo fundamental conditions. They can only influence how those conditions affect living beings. The Sumerians understood this intuitively. In their own society, leaders did not invent agriculture, rivers, or seasons. They organized labor around these realities. Kings did not create land. They managed its distribution. Priests did not create water. They regulated its use. The same logic applies to gods. This parallel between human and divine authority is deliberate. The cosmos is imagined as an extension of social reality, scaled up but governed by similar principles. Authority emerges when coordination becomes necessary. The texts make this clear by delaying the appearance of divine personalities until after the world has acquired enough structure to support them. Before that, there is nothing for gods to do. Once differentiation increases, however, the need for mediation arises. Conflicts become possible. Imbalances appear. Resources become unevenly distributed. At this point, anonymous forces are no longer sufficient. Representation becomes necessary. Gods provide that representation. They give faces to forces so that humans can interact with them. They provide narratives that explain why things happen. They establish rules that stabilize relationships, but they do not replace the underlying forces. They sit atop them. This layered model is evident in how disasters are portrayed. Even when gods decide to act, the outcomes are determined by impersonal forces. A god may decree a flood, but the flood behaves according to water's nature, not divine micromanagement. Structures collapse because water undermines them. Life is lost because oxygen is displaced. These are not moral processes. They are physical ones. The gods initiate. The world executes. This distinction reinforces the idea that the world is already functioning independently. Gods influence it, but they do not fully control it. The Anunnaki exemplify this role. They are judges, not creators. They determine fate, not existence. Their authority operates within the framework of a world that has already produced living beings, social systems, and consequences. Their judgments presuppose a functioning world. There must be lives to judge, actions to evaluate, outcomes to assign. None of this exists at the origin. This means the Anunnaki enter late by necessity. The texts are consistent on this point. The Anunnaki are always situated within a developed divine hierarchy. They are never primordial. They are never first. Their very name implies lineage and rank. Lineage requires a history. Rank requires a system. Both presuppose an already functioning world. This is why the earliest gods to appear are often less anthropomorphic. They are closer to forces than personalities. As the world becomes more complex, gods become more human-like. They argue, they scheme, they feel frustration. This progression mirrors social development. Early authority is diffuse. Later authority becomes centralized and personal. The Sumerian texts reflect this progression without apology. They do not try to smooth over the transition, they allow it to remain visible. This visibility is important because it preserves the memory that gods are not inevitable. They are contingent. They appear because the world reaches a point where governance becomes necessary. This necessity is not framed as a flaw. It is framed as an outcome of growth. As populations increase, as cities expand, as interactions multiply, the risk of instability rises. Gods emerge to manage that risk. This is why later texts are filled with concerns about noise, disorder, and excess. These concerns do not exist at the beginning. They emerge alongside gods. The gods are not disturbed by chaos at the origin, because chaos does not yet exist in a problematic sense. Chaos becomes problematic only when order becomes valuable. Order becomes valuable when there is something to lose. Before that, loss has no meaning. This again reinforces the idea that gods enter a world that already functions. They are drawn in by the need to preserve what has developed. This is a fundamentally conservative role. Gods are guardians of structure, not inventors of it. This conservatism explains why gods are often portrayed as resistant to change. They prefer stability. They punish disruption. They enforce boundaries. These behaviors make sense in a world that has already achieved a degree of order. They would be meaningless in a world still forming itself. The Sumerians recognized this. They did not imagine gods impatiently waiting to create. They imagined gods responding to a world that had become difficult to manage. This response is not always successful. Gods make mistakes. Their decisions cause suffering. Their attempts to impose order sometimes create greater disorder. These failures reinforce the idea that gods are not omnipotent. They are constrained by the world they govern. This constraint is evident in the way gods are bound by their own decrees. Once a decision is made, it cannot be easily undone. Cleverness is required to work around it. This legalistic portrayal of divine authority reflects human experience. Laws bind lawmakers. Systems constrain rulers. Again, the parallel is deliberate. The world gods enter already has rules, even if those rules are not formalized. Those rules arise from the nature of existence itself. Gods codify them. They do not invent them. This codification process is visible in texts that describe the assignment of duties. Each god receives a domain. These domains correspond to pre-existing aspects of reality. The god does not create the domain. The domain legitimizes the god. This inversion is important. Authority derives its legitimacy from alignment with reality, not the other way around. When gods fail to align with reality, they face resistance. Other gods oppose them. Humans suffer. The system destabilizes. The texts do not hide this. They portray divine conflict openly. This openness suggests that the Sumerians did not view divine authority as unquestionable. They saw it as powerful but fallible. This fallibility makes sense only if gods are not original. If they were original, their will would define reality absolutely. But reality resists them. This resistance comes from the deeper layer of existence that predates authority. The gods enter a world that already has momentum. They cannot stop rivers from flowing. They can only influence when and how they flood. They cannot stop time. They can only mark it. They cannot prevent death. They can only assign fate. This limitation defines their role. The Sumerian worldview does not diminish gods by acknowledging these limits. It contextualizes them. Gods are necessary because the world has reached a stage where unmanaged forces cause suffering. Before that stage, gods are unnecessary. This idea is uncomfortable for traditions that want gods to be ultimate, but it is consistent with the Sumerian texts. It also explains why gods are often depicted as anxious. They worry about noise. They worry about population. They worry about disorder. These worries belong to managers, not creators. Creators would not worry about what they created. Managers must. The Anunnaki's concern with fate reflects this managerial anxiety. Fate is a tool for controlling outcomes in a world that resists control. Before fate, outcomes are unpredictable. After fate, they are constrained. This constraint is not absolute. It can be challenged. It can be altered. But it exists. The world the gods enter already contains unpredictability. Gods attempt to reduce it. This attempt never fully succeeds. The Sumerians understood this and preserved it in their myths. They did not idealize divine governance. They portrayed it as necessary but imperfect. This portrayal makes sense only if the world predates governance. The earliest phase, where the world functions without gods, serves as a reminder that existence does not depend on authority. Authority depends on existence. This dependency shapes every divine action. Gods cannot erase the foundation they stand on. They can only build on it, and sometimes their constructions collapse. This collapse is not the end of the world. It is a reset. The world continues. Floods erase cities. Gods survive. Humans return. Authority is re-established in modified form. This cycle reinforces the idea that the world persists independently of governance. Gods come and go. Their roles change. Their influence waxes and wanes. The world remains. This perspective is quietly embedded in the way the texts unfold. They do not declare it, they demonstrate it. By allowing gods to enter late, the texts preserve the primacy of existence over authority. This primacy is not celebrated, it is assumed. The Sumerians did not need to argue for it. They lived with it. They knew that rivers would flow whether or not gods were pleased. They knew that floods would come regardless of prayers. They knew that life would continue after dynasties fell. Their mythology reflects this realism. Gods are powerful because they help manage a difficult world. They are not powerful because they created it. This distinction changes how every later story is read. The Anunnaki are no longer mysterious architects. They are administrators. They are not evidence of an advanced origin. They are evidence of a complex system requiring oversight. Before them, the world does not need oversight. After them, oversight becomes unavoidable. This shift is not presented as improvement. It is presented as adaptation. The texts do not tell us that the world is better once gods appear. They tell us that it is more complicated. Complication demands structure. Structure demands authority. Authority demands justification. That justification is provided through myth. But beneath the myth, the earlier world remains. A world that functioned before gods arrived. A world that continues to function beneath them. A world that reminds us, quietly and consistently, that authority is a response, not a beginning. And that everything the gods do is shaped by the fact that they entered a world that was already alive, already moving, and already capable of continuing without them. The moment hierarchies appear in the record is not marked by a single declaration or a dramatic shift in tone. It emerges gradually, almost cautiously, as if the texts themselves are aware that something fundamental is changing and choose not to draw attention to it too quickly. Hierarchy does not arrive announced. It settles in. It becomes visible only once distinctions have accumulated enough weight to require ranking, placement, and control. Before this moment, difference exists, but it does not yet imply superiority or subordination. Forces separate, domains become distinguishable, roles begin to take shape. But none of this immediately produces hierarchy. Differentiation alone is not enough. Hierarchy requires valuation. One thing must be placed above another. One function must be considered more authoritative, more decisive, or more binding than the rest. The texts show remarkable restraint in delaying this step. When hierarchy finally appears, it does so through language rather than decree. Certain terms begin to recur. Relationships are described in ways that imply ordering rather than mere coexistence. Some beings are described as deciding, while others are described as carrying out those decisions. Some forces become central, others peripheral. This shift is subtle, but once it begins, it cannot be reversed. What is important is that hierarchy does not appear at the origin of existence, nor does it appear immediately with the introduction of gods. There is a transitional phase where gods exist, but hierarchy among them is not yet rigid. Authority is still fluid, roles overlap, responsibilities are negotiated rather than enforced. This fluidity reflects a world still adjusting to complexity. Hierarchy becomes necessary only when fluidity becomes inefficient. As interactions increase, ambiguity becomes costly. Unclear authority leads to conflict, delay, and instability. At this point, ranking begins to serve a practical purpose. The Sumerian texts preserve this logic without justifying it explicitly. They do not say hierarchy is good, they show it becoming unavoidable. The moment hierarchies appear, the tone of the material changes. Decisions begin to have lasting consequences. Disputes arise that cannot be resolved through balance alone. Someone must decide whose will prevails. This is when councils begin to matter. The appearance of councils is not the beginning of hierarchy, but it is its confirmation. A council presupposes inequality, even when it presents itself as collective. Some voices carry more weight, some decisions are final, some beings enforce outcomes. Before hierarchy, councils would be unnecessary. After hierarchy, councils become essential tools for managing it. The Anunnaki are firmly situated within this hierarchical phase. Their identity depends on it. They are not merely gods, they are ranked gods, judges, authorities whose decisions carry binding force. This ranking is reflected linguistically. Titles appear. Lineage becomes important. Relationships are defined not only by connection, but by position. Once hierarchy appears, the world can no longer be described as merely structured. It becomes ordered in a directional sense. Above and below gain moral and political significance. Commands flow downward. Accountability flows upward. This directional order is new. Before it, causation exists without command. After it, command reshapes causation. The texts do not celebrate this development. They record it. This neutrality is important. It suggests that the scribes understood hierarchy as a tool rather than a virtue. It solves certain problems while creating others. One of the problems hierarchy introduces is distance. Those at the top become removed from the conditions they govern. Decisions are made abstractly. Outcomes are felt concretely by those below. This distance creates tension, and that tension appears repeatedly in later myths. Gods misjudge. Decrees cause unintended suffering. Authority must be circumvented through cleverness or secrecy. These tensions would not exist without hierarchy. The earliest phase lacks such conflict precisely because there is no vertical separation. Once hierarchy appears, conflict becomes structural. This is not a failure of the system, it is an inherent feature of it. The Sumerians seem to have understood this. Their myths do not depict hierarchy as a perfect solution. They depict it as necessary compromise. This is why the appearance of hierarchy is often followed by narratives of resistance, negotiation, and adjustment. Authority is asserted, but it is rarely absolute. The moment hierarchy appears also marks the beginning of fate as a formal concept. Fate requires ranking. Someone must assign it. Someone must enforce it. Before hierarchy, outcomes happen. After hierarchy, outcomes are allocated. This allocation introduces moral weight. Lives are no longer just lived, they are evaluated. Evaluation requires standards, standards require authority. This chain of development is consistent throughout the tradition. The scribes did not isolate hierarchy as a purely divine phenomenon. They mirrored it with human institutions. Kingship appears alongside divine ranking. Law emerges alongside divine decree. Social classes solidify as divine roles become fixed. This parallel is not accidental. The Sumerians understood hierarchy as a universal response to complexity, not a uniquely cosmic invention. Human society and divine society develop together. The moment hierarchies appear in the record therefore marks a turning point not only in cosmology, but in anthropology. Humanity's relationship to power changes. Humans are no longer interacting primarily with forces. They are interacting with authorities. This interaction alters behavior. Appeasement replaces adaptation. Obedience replaces balance. Ritual replaces observation. These shifts are visible in the archaeological and textual record. Temples grow larger. Offerings become standardized. Priests gain influence. The divine world becomes bureaucratic. This bureaucracy reflects the same impulse that produces hierarchy among gods. Efficiency, predictability, and control become priorities. But with these priorities comes rigidity. The texts repeatedly show that rigidity produces crises. Floods, famines, and social collapse are often framed as consequences of excessive control rather than insufficient authority. This framing suggests a deep ambivalence toward hierarchy. The Sumerians did not imagine hierarchy as an unqualified good. They saw it as a response to conditions that were themselves the result of earlier developments. Hierarchy solves some problems and introduces others. This ambivalence is preserved by the way the texts continue to reference earlier non-hierarchical states even after hierarchy is established. Flood narratives temporarily erase hierarchy. Gods lose authority. Humans are reduced to survivors. The world returns to a more primordial condition. These resets do not erase hierarchy permanently, but they remind the system of its foundations. The fact that hierarchy can be undone, even temporarily, implies that it is not intrinsic to existence. It is contingent. This contingency is crucial. It prevents hierarchy from claiming ultimate legitimacy. Even the highest gods are bound by rules, by fate, by oaths. These constraints imply a deeper order that predates authority. The moment hierarchies appear, therefore, does not overwrite what came before. It layers on top of it. This layering is visible in the text structure. Earlier material is not discarded, it is embedded. Hierarchy sits above continuity, not in place of it. This structural memory allows the Sumerian worldview to remain flexible. Authority can be challenged. Systems can be reconfigured. New gods can rise. Old gods can fall. None of this threatens existence itself. This is why the texts are able to portray divine conflict without collapsing into chaos. Authority struggles, but the world persists. The emergence of hierarchy also introduces the concept of legitimacy. Authority must justify itself. This justification often takes the form of genealogy, mythic descent, or cosmic mandate. But these justifications always come after the fact. They are explanations, not causes. The Sumerians understood this. They placed justification after authority, not before. This sequencing matters. It reveals that hierarchy is not self-evident. It must be explained. The earliest phase requires no explanation. It simply exists. Hierarchy requires narrative support. This is why the appearance of hierarchy coincides with an explosion of mythic storytelling. Stories legitimize power. They explain why certain beings rule and others obey. Before hierarchy, stories are unnecessary. This shift transforms the role of the scribe. Earlier scribes record, later scribes interpret. They weave narratives that stabilize authority. Yet even in these narratives, traces of the earlier worldview remain. Gods are never fully in control. Authority is always negotiated. This negotiation is especially visible in the relationships between gods. Councils argue. Decisions are contested. Outcomes are revised. These dynamics reflect a system that knows its own limits. The Anunnaki's authority is significant, but it is not absolute. They operate within a hierarchy that is itself contingent. This contingency is perhaps the most important feature of the Sumerian conception of hierarchy. It is strong, but not eternal. The moment hierarchies appear is therefore not the end of development. It is the beginning of a new kind of instability. Instability now arises not from undifferentiated forces, but from conflicting authorities. This is a different kind of risk. The Sumerians accepted this risk because the alternative was worse. The world without hierarchy could not sustain the complexity they had achieved. But they did not forget that hierarchy was a choice imposed by circumstance, not a law of existence. This memory allows the text to critique authority without rejecting it. Gods can be powerful and wrong at the same time. Kings can rule and fail. Laws can stabilize and oppress. These insights are possible only because hierarchy is understood as layered, not original. The moment hierarchies appear in the record, then, is not a triumph. It is a concession to complexity, a concession to growth, a concession to the limits of balance. The texts do not dramatize this concession. They let it unfold. This quiet unfolding makes it easy to miss, but it is foundational. Once hierarchy exists, the world cannot return fully to its earlier state. Even floods cannot erase memory. Authority returns, modified but persistent. The Sumerians knew this. They did not expect to undo hierarchy permanently, but they preserved the knowledge that it was not always there. This knowledge shapes everything that follows. It explains why authority is questioned, why wisdom intervenes, why boundaries are tested, why fate can be altered. The moment hierarchies appear is therefore not just a historical marker. It is a philosophical threshold. On one side lies existence governed by conditions. On the other lies existence governed by decisions. The transition between them is gradual, careful, and irreversible. The texts guide us across this threshold without announcing it, trusting that the structure itself will communicate what explanation would only flatten. And beneath the hierarchy that emerges, the earlier world remains, silent but present, shaping the limits of power without ever needing to speak. What changes once the Anunnaki are finally named is not the sudden appearance of gods where there were none before, but a shift in how reality is spoken about, organized, and controlled. Naming does not create the Anunnaki, it reveals a new way of relating to power. Before this moment, forces exist, roles emerge, and authority begins to take shape without requiring fixed identities. With naming, something hardens. What was once fluid becomes anchored. What was once relational becomes positional. The act of naming marks a decisive transition in the record. It signals that the world has reached a level of complexity where anonymity is no longer sufficient. Forces can no longer remain diffuse. Authority can no longer be implied. Responsibility can no longer be shared without definition. Naming becomes necessary because accountability becomes necessary. Before the Anunnaki are named, power exists, but it is not centralized. Decisions occur, but they are not attributed to specific entities. Outcomes happen, but no single will can be identified as their source. This ambiguity allows the world to function without blame, without justification, and without appeal. Once the Anunnaki are named, this ambiguity begins to disappear. Naming creates anchors. An anchor allows power to be located. Once power can be located, it can be approached, negotiated with, resisted, or feared. This changes the nature of interaction entirely. The world is no longer governed solely by conditions. It is governed by decisions made by identifiable authorities. This does not mean that the Anunnaki suddenly begin to act. They were always present as forces, as functions, as emerging roles. What changes is that they are now recognized as discrete authorities with defined scope. This recognition brings clarity, but it also brings limitation. When something is named, it becomes bounded. It acquires a domain. It acquires expectations. It acquires constraints. The Anunnaki, once named, are no longer simply expressions of cosmic order. They are responsible for maintaining it. Responsibility introduces pressure. This pressure is visible immediately in the tone of the texts. Once the Anunnaki are named, Concern enters the narrative. Decisions are weighed. Consequences are anticipated. The world is no longer assumed to balance itself indefinitely. Oversight becomes a requirement. The Anunnaki are named at the moment when oversight becomes unavoidable. This moment coincides with the emergence of fate as a formal concept. Fate requires assigners. Before naming, outcomes unfold. After naming, outcomes are allocated. The Anunnaki are not just powerful beings, they are arbiters. Arbitration changes everything. Before arbitration, imbalance is a condition. After arbitration, imbalance is a failure. Someone must answer for it. This is one of the most profound shifts introduced by naming. The world becomes morally legible. Before this point, floods, droughts, and death are not punishments. They are events. After naming, these same events can be interpreted as judgments. This interpretive shift does not change the events themselves. It changes how humans relate to them. Once the Anunnaki are named, humans are no longer dealing primarily with an impersonal world. They are dealing with authority. Authority invites appeal. Appeal invites obedience. Obedience invites enforcement. This chain reaction is not framed as a deliberate plan. It is an emergent consequence of naming. The texts do not suggest that the Anunnaki demanded to be named. Naming arises from the needs of the world they oversee. As populations grow, as cities expand, as labour becomes organised, the need to explain why certain outcomes occur becomes urgent. Naming provides explanation. It also provides legitimacy. Once the Anunnaki are named, hierarchy becomes explicit. The world is no longer just layered, it is ranked. Certain decisions carry more weight than others. Certain voices override others. This ranking solidifies authority but also introduces distance. Those who decide are no longer embedded within the conditions they govern. They stand apart. This distance is reflected in the language. The Anunnaki sit. They convene. They deliberate. These are not metaphors of immersion. They are metaphors of separation. Sitting implies elevation. Convening implies exclusivity. Deliberation implies control over outcomes. None of these concepts apply before naming. Once named, the Anunnaki become associated with specific locations. Assemblies are held. Spaces are designated. Authority is spatialized. This spatialization mirrors developments in human society. Temples become centers of power. Administrative buildings appear. Records are stored. Authority becomes something you can point to. The divine world reflects this structure. This mirroring is not accidental. It indicates that the Sumerians understood divine authority as an extension of social authority, not as its source. The gods govern because governance has become necessary, not because governance defines existence. Naming the Anunnaki formalizes this governance. Formalization introduces rules. Rules introduce predictability, but they also introduce rigidity. This rigidity becomes visible almost immediately. Decisions made by the Anunnaki are binding, even when they produce suffering. Once decrees are issued, they cannot be easily revoked. Cleverness is required to work around them. This is a new problem. Before naming, there are no decrees to be trapped by. The texts repeatedly return to this tension. Authority stabilizes the world, but it also constrains it. The Anunnaki embody this tension. They are necessary, but they are also dangerous. Naming makes this danger visible. Before naming, power is diffuse and therefore difficult to oppose. After naming, power is concentrated and therefore capable of abuse. The Sumerians do not ignore this risk. They build it into their mythology. The Anunnaki argue. They disagree. They make decisions that are later regretted. These portrayals are not irreverent. They are realistic. They reflect an understanding that authority, once formalized, is never perfect. This realism extends to the relationship between gods and humans. Once the Anunnaki are named, humans become subjects rather than participants. They are acted upon rather than simply existing within conditions. This changes how humans understand their place in the world. Before naming, survival depends on adaptation. After naming, survival depends on compliance. This shift is subtle but profound. Adaptation requires observation and responsiveness. Compliance requires obedience and interpretation of rules. The Sumerians experienced both, and their texts preserve the transition. Naming the Anunnaki also introduces the concept of transgression. Before naming, nothing can be violated. There are no laws. After naming, there are expectations. Failure to meet them becomes wrongdoing. Wrongdoing introduces guilt. Guilt introduces fear. Fear introduces ritual. This progression is visible archaeologically and textually. As divine authority becomes formalized, ritual practice expands. Offerings become standardized. Calendars regulate worship. Behavior is prescribed. These developments coincide with the naming of gods. Naming does not create fear, but it gives fear a focus. Humans now know whom to appease. This appeasement becomes a central feature of religious life. The Anunnaki are not distant abstractions. They are present authorities whose favour matters. This presence reshapes time. Festivals mark decisions. Rituals commemorate decrees. History becomes punctuated by divine actions. Before naming, time flows. After naming, time is structured. This structuring makes memory possible in a new way. Events can be attributed. Causes can be identified. Stories can be told. Narrative explodes after naming. Before naming, the texts are sparse. After naming, they become rich. This richness is not merely literary. It reflects an expansion of conceptual space. Naming allows complexity to be managed through language. But language also simplifies. It reduces nuance. It imposes categories. The Anunnaki, once named, are reduced to roles, judges, decision-makers, fate assigners. These roles are useful, but they are also limiting. The gods become predictable. Predictability makes authority stable, but it also makes it brittle. This brittleness is exposed whenever the world behaves unexpectedly. Floods overwhelm decrees. Wisdom circumvents law. Life persists in ways authority did not anticipate. These moments reveal that naming does not grant total control. The forces that preceded names still operate. They operate beneath the Anunnaki, shaping the outcomes of their decisions. This layered reality creates tension throughout the mythology. Gods act as if they control fate, but fate often escapes their intentions. This escape is not rebellion. It is continuity asserting itself. Naming cannot erase the foundational layer of existence. It can only overlay it. The Sumerians appear to have been keenly aware of this. Their myths do not present divine authority as final. They present it as necessary but provisional. The Anunnaki's judgments can be modified. Oaths can be circumvented. Decrees can be softened. These narrative devices preserve the idea that authority is negotiable. This negotiability is only possible because authority is not origin. Naming does not change this fact. It makes it visible. Once the Anunnaki are named, the world becomes legible in a new way, but it also becomes fragile in a new way. Authority concentrates risk. When authority fails, consequences are widespread. This is why later myths often depict divine decisions leading to catastrophe. These catastrophes are not evidence of divine cruelty. They are evidence of systemic vulnerability. A world governed by decisions can be destabilized by bad decisions. A world governed by conditions cannot. The Sumerians understood this trade-off. They did not present naming as progress or decline. They presented it as transition. Something is gained, something is lost. What is gained is coordination, predictability, shared meaning. What is lost is anonymity, flexibility, indifference. Before naming, the world does not care. After naming, it appears to care deeply. This appearance is comforting and terrifying at the same time. Comforting because events can be explained. Terrifying because those explanations imply judgment. The Anunnaki embody this duality. They are protectors and enforcers. They stabilize and constrain. They make life possible in a crowded world, but they also make life subject to evaluation. This evaluation is new. Before naming, there is no measure against which existence is weighed. After naming, standards exist. These standards are not always fair. They reflect the priorities of authority. The texts do not hide this. They show gods favouring some cities over others, some kings over others, some humans over others. This favouritism reveals the human nature of divine governance. It also reinforces the idea that naming introduces subjectivity. Impersonal forces do not favour, authorities do. This favouritism introduces inequality. Inequality introduces resentment. Resentment introduces conflict. The mythology reflects these tensions openly. Divine wars, human suffering, repeated resets. These are not signs of a broken system. They are signs of a system grappling with its own limits. Naming the Anunnaki is therefore not the end of ambiguity. It is the beginning of a different kind of ambiguity. The question is no longer what exists, but who decides. This question dominates all later narratives. It never arises before naming. Before naming, the world simply unfolds. After naming, the world must be governed. This governance is never fully secure. The Anunnaki hold authority, but they do not eliminate uncertainty. They manage it. This management is exhausting. Gods grow weary. They complain. They seek solutions. These portrayals are telling. They show authority under strain. If authority were identical with existence, it would not strain. It would simply be. The fact that authority strains proves it is layered. Naming reveals this strain. It brings power into focus, and with it, responsibility. The Anunnaki, once named, cannot escape the consequences of their decisions. They are no longer anonymous forces. They are accountable. This accountability is one of the most human aspects of the divine portrayal. It suggests that the Sumerians did not see gods as distant absolutes, but as participants in a system larger than themselves. That system is existence itself. Existence predates naming. Naming changes how existence is experienced, not what existence is. This is the most important change introduced by the naming of the Anunnaki. The world does not become new, it becomes governed. And governance, once introduced, cannot be undone completely. Even when floods erase cities, authority returns. Even when gods withdraw, their structures remain. Naming leaves residue. It reshapes memory. It reshapes expectation. It reshapes fear and hope. The Sumerians understood this, and their texts reflect it. They did not treat naming lightly. They delayed it. They prepared for it. They showed its consequences. Because once the Anunnaki are named, the world can no longer pretend that power is diffuse, that outcomes are neutral, or that existence is indifferent. The world becomes a place where decisions matter, where judgment exists, where fate can be assigned, and where authority, for better or worse, becomes unavoidable. That is what changes, not the existence of the world, not the presence of power, but the way power is spoken, located, and held. And once that shift occurs, every story that follows is shaped by it, whether it acknowledges it or not. Memory, editing, and the quiet loss of earlier stages do not appear in the Sumerian record as acts of deliberate erasure. There is no moment where someone decides to remove the past. There is no decree ordering silence. Instead, what disappears does so gradually, through preference, repetition, and the simple mechanics of what gets copied and what does not. The loss is quiet because it does not announce itself. It happens while attention shifts elsewhere. The earlier stages of existence do not vanish because they are denied. They vanish because they stop being necessary to explain the present. Once gods are named, once hierarchies solidify, once authority becomes the dominant framework for understanding the world, earlier modes of thought begin to feel irrelevant. They are not false. They are simply less useful. Scribes copy what answers current questions. What no longer answers those questions is left behind. This is how memory changes without intention. The Sumerians did not preserve texts as sacred artifacts frozen in time. They copied them because copying served a purpose. Tablets wore down, clay broke, archives burned or flooded. What survived was what was recopied. What was recopied was what still mattered. As authority became central, texts that explained authority mattered more. This is where editing begins, not as falsification, but as selection. Earlier material that described existence without rulers, forces without names, and order without governance did not disappear overnight. It was slowly compressed, simplified, absorbed into later frameworks. What once required careful description became a brief reference. What once stood alone became an introduction that readers hurried past. Over time, introductions are skipped. This process is visible in how later texts assume knowledge rather than explain it. They no longer linger on primordial conditions. They refer to them briefly, if at all, before moving on to what now seems more important. Counsels, decisions, judgments, fate. The beginning moves closer and closer to the moment when authority appears. This shift does not require conspiracy. It requires habit. As generations pass, scribes are trained within existing structures. They inherit assumptions. They do not question where those assumptions came from. They reproduce them faithfully. Faithful reproduction can still result in loss. The earliest worldview, which required patience to understand and offered little narrative reward, becomes less appealing. It does not explain suffering. It does not justify power. It does not assign blame. As society grows more stratified, these explanations become essential. Texts that provide them are favoured. Texts that do not quietly recede. This is how editing happens without editors. The memory of earlier stages becomes thinner, not because it is denied, but because it is no longer elaborated. What remains are traces, a phrase, a line, a reference to a time before something was so. These traces are easy to overlook. They do not fit neatly into later stories. They feel out of place. Some readers interpret them as poetic remnants or symbolic flourishes. Others treat them as mythic exaggeration. Few recognize them as structural memory. Structural memory does not preserve detail. It preserves position. The earliest stages survive not in full descriptions, but in where they sit relative to later developments. They always come before. They are always assumed. They are never fully explained again. This placement matters. It means that even when the details are lost, the sequence remains. Existence precedes authority. Continuity precedes rule. Forces precede faces. The texts never reverse this order. This consistency suggests that the loss of detail is not accidental confusion. It is erosion. Erosion does not destroy foundations. It exposes them intermittently. The Sumerians lived in an environment where erosion was a constant reality. Rivers reshaped land. Floods erased boundaries. What remained were patterns, not exact forms. Their textual tradition reflects this same process. The earliest worldview erodes, but it does not vanish. Editing also occurs through reinterpretation. As later scribes read older material, they understand it through their own conceptual frameworks. Terms that once refer to conditions are reinterpreted as beings. Processes are reimagined as decisions. Relationships are reframed as hierarchies. This reinterpretation is not malicious. It is inevitable. Language changes. Concepts shift. What once required careful abstraction becomes simplified through personification. The primordial state becomes a story about gods. Forces become characters. Emergence becomes intention. This narrative turn makes the material easier to transmit, but it also distorts it. The loss here is not factual. It is conceptual. What disappears is not the memory that something existed before the gods, but the understanding of what that something was. It becomes tempting to imagine it as merely another group of gods, another age ruled by different beings. This projection satisfies narrative expectation, but it misrepresents the original thought. The original worldview did not imagine replacement. It imagined transformation. Editing through reinterpretation replaces transformation with succession. That replacement is subtle, but it changes everything. Once the earlier stage is imagined as ruled by other gods, the idea that existence ever functioned without rule becomes unthinkable. Authority becomes eternal, merely changing hands. The Sumerian texts resist this conclusion, but later readings often impose it. This is part of the quiet loss. The loss also occurs through ritualization. As religious practice becomes formalized, attention shifts from explanation to performance. Rituals do not require deep understanding of origins. They require correct repetition. Over time, repetition replaces reflection. The gods must be honored, offerings must be made, festivals must be observed. The reason these practices exist becomes secondary. Texts that explain ritual take precedence over texts that explore cosmology. This shift further marginalizes early material. The earliest worldview does not support ritual easily. It offers no gods to appease, no commands to follow, no favors to seek. It does not fit a ritual economy, so it is remembered less. This does not mean it is forgotten entirely. It survives in awkward places, in opening lines that feel disconnected from what follows, in brief acknowledgements that are never elaborated, in phrases that sound older than the stories built around them. These awkward remnants are clues. They indicate that something older once stood there. The scribes did not erase it completely. They could not. It was embedded too deeply in the structure of the tradition. Instead, they built over it. This building process creates layers. Later stories rest on earlier assumptions without always understanding them. When modern readers encounter these texts, they often read from the top layer down. They begin with gods, councils, and decrees. They interpret everything beneath through that lens. This reverses the original sequence. The result is confusion. The earliest phases appear inconsistent or underdeveloped because they are being read with expectations they were never meant to satisfy. This misreading accelerates the loss. What is not understood is rarely valued. What is not valued is rarely preserved. This cycle continues across generations. Yet despite this, the Sumerian texts never fully abandon their earlier stages. They continue to gesture backward. They continue to acknowledge that there was a time before authority. They do so not through explicit reminders, but through structural habits. They begin early. They delay naming. They treat authority as emergent rather than original. These habits persist even as details fade. This persistence suggests that the earliest worldview mattered deeply to the scribes, even if they could no longer fully articulate it. They did not rewrite it to fit later beliefs. They allowed it to remain partially opaque. This opacity is often mistaken for confusion or mythic vagueness. It is neither. It is the residue of a worldview that outlived its explanatory context. The quiet loss of earlier stages is therefore not total. It is selective. What is lost is clarity. What remains is sequence. This sequence continues to challenge later interpretations. It insists that something came before gods. It insists that authority is not foundational. It insists that existence does not require governance to begin. These insistences are not argued. They are embedded. Even when later texts focus almost entirely on divine action, they cannot escape the need to begin somewhere earlier. This necessity is telling. If authority were truly original, there would be no need to gesture beyond it. The fact that the texts do gesture beyond it, even briefly, even vaguely, indicates that the memory of an earlier state could not be fully suppressed. Editing softened it. Memory thinned it, but structure preserved it. This structural preservation is the key to understanding the Sumerian tradition. It allows the earliest worldview to survive beneath layers of reinterpretation. It also explains why modern readers who slow down, who resist the urge to rush to gods and drama, can still detect it. The quiet loss is not complete silence. It is a lowering of volume. The earlier stages are still there, but they require patience to hear. They speak in absence, in what is not explained, in what is assumed rather than stated. This is why the earliest phase often feels like a background rather than a subject. It is treated as something everyone once knew and no longer needed to be told. This assumption marks the final stage of memory loss. When something is no longer explained, it is on the verge of being forgotten. Yet forgetting is never absolute. The Sumerians lived with cycles of destruction and rebuilding. They knew that loss was part of continuity. They also knew that not everything lost stays lost forever. Floods erase cities, but foundations remain beneath the mud. Texts erode, but structures remain beneath interpretation. The earliest worldview survives in this way, not as doctrine, not as narrative, but as an underlying order that continues to shape how everything else is understood. Memory fades, editing simplifies, but the foundation holds. This is the quiet truth the Sumerian texts preserve without announcing it. The loss of earlier stages is real, but it is not final. What existed before the Anunnaki was not erased. It was covered, and what is covered can still be uncovered if one is willing to look beneath what later generations found easier to remember. A quiet thought before sleep, what it means if something came first, is not meant to resolve what has been explored, but to leave it resting gently in the mind, without pressure to conclude. The Sumerian texts do not end with certainty, and neither should the thought they leave behind. They point backward, not to offer answers, but to remind us that the beginning of existence was not shaped around authority, intention, or purpose in the way later ages would come to expect. If something came first, truly first, before gods were named, before hierarchies formed, before decisions were made and rules enforced, then existence itself does not depend on control. It does not depend on judgment. It does not depend on being watched, corrected, or managed. It exists prior to all of that, and continues regardless of how those layers rise and fall above it. This realization is subtle, but it changes the weight we place on everything that follows. The Sumerian worldview does not suggest that gods are illusions or that authority is meaningless. It suggests something quieter and more unsettling. Authority is not the ground of reality. It is a response to reality becoming complex enough to require guidance. Gods do not explain why existence exists. They explain how existence is navigated once it becomes crowded, unstable, and difficult to manage. If something came first, then power is not sacred by default. It is functional, it serves a purpose, and that purpose can change. This idea runs against many later traditions that seek certainty, permanence, and reassurance in the notion of an original ruler, a first will, or an ultimate planner. The Sumerian texts offer no such comfort. They do not promise that existence is oriented toward meaning, justice, or outcome. They only show that meaning, justice, and outcome are layered on later, built carefully and imperfectly on top of something older and indifferent. That indifference is not cruelty. It is neutrality. The earliest state described in the text does not favour or oppose. It does not reward or punish. It does not notice. It simply allows conditions to unfold. Later, when gods are named and authority takes hold, the world begins to appear responsive, as though events are tied to intention. But this responsiveness is an interpretation layered over a deeper continuity that never fully disappears. If something came first, then the world does not exist because someone wanted it to. It exists because existence itself was possible. This possibility is unsettling because it removes reassurance. There is no original promise that things will turn out well. There is no foundational guarantee of justice. Those guarantees, when they appear, are constructed, negotiated, revised, and sometimes withdrawn. The Sumerians understood this. They lived in a landscape where floods erased cities without asking permission, where kings rose and fell, where gods changed roles, where memory was fragile. Their myths reflect this realism. They do not hide the instability of authority. They do not portray divine rule as flawless or eternal. They show it struggling to keep pace with a world that never fully submits. If something came first, then even the gods are participants rather than masters. This does not diminish them. It contextualizes them. They matter because the world has reached a point where mattering itself becomes necessary. Before that point, there is only continuation. This continuation is not comforting, but it is grounding. It suggests that existence does not hinge on belief, obedience, or favour. It continues beneath those things. For a moment, consider what it means to live in a world built this way. It means that when systems fail, existence does not collapse with them. When authority dissolves, something remains. When explanations break down, reality continues to function. The Sumerians encoded this understanding not as philosophy, but as structure. They began their texts early. They delayed naming. They separated origin from authority. They allowed silence to stand where later traditions would insist on explanation. This silence is not empty. It is full of implication. If something came first, then the world is not owned. It is not possessed by gods, rulers, or even humanity. It is shared, not by agreement, but by circumstance. This idea changes how power is viewed. Power becomes provisional, necessary perhaps, but never ultimate. It also changes how loss is understood. When cities fall, when dynasties end, when gods withdraw, these are not endings of existence. They are transitions within it. The Sumerians did not write this as consolation. They wrote it as observation. Their myths are full of endings that are not final. Floods that erase but do not annihilate. Judgments that are revised. Fates that can be altered. Authority that is challenged. All of this makes sense only if something more fundamental endures beneath it all, that something is not a being, it is not a plan, it is not a purpose, it is continuity. Continuity does not promise meaning, it permits it. Meaning arises later, once beings capable of caring appear. Humans care, gods care. Before them, there is no caring. This does not make the earlier state superior or purer, it makes it different. It is tempting to romanticize a world without authority, without judgment, without hierarchy. The Sumerian texts do not do this. They do not suggest that such a world could support human life as it came to exist. They show clearly why authority emerged, complexity demanded it, but they also show that authority is not the foundation. It is a tool, and tools can be put down. This understanding lingers quietly beneath the surface of the texts. It suggests that no system, however powerful, is permanent. It suggests that existence does not depend on being governed correctly. It suggests that even when explanations fail, something remains. For those listening, perhaps late at night, perhaps in a moment of stillness, this thought does not need to be resolved. It is not an argument to be won. It is an idea to sit with. If something came first, then the world is older than every story told about it, older than every god, older than every fear, older than every hope. That does not make the world empty. It makes it deep, and depth does not require understanding to exist. The Sumerians seem to accept this. They did not try to explain everything. They allowed the beginning to remain quiet, not because it was insignificant, but because it was beyond command. That quiet beginning still sits beneath everything that followed, beneath temples, beneath laws, beneath names, and beneath the countless attempts to explain why things are the way they are. It does not speak, it does not judge, it does not demand belief, it simply persists. And if that is true, then perhaps the weight we place on authority, on judgment, on explanation, can rest a little lighter. Perhaps it is enough to recognize that existence does not require permission, that it did not begin with a command, that it does not end when stories change, and that long before gods were named, before worlds were ruled, before anything needed to be justified, there was already something holding everything quietly in place, something that didn't need to be watched, something that didn't need to be explained, something that came first, and remains even now whether we name it or not.